Los Angeles, California. Every day of every year, young people from all over the country come here, hoping to make their dreams come true. Some want to become movie stars, others dream of singing on stage or working in the fashion industry, but not everyone shares these hopes and dreams. Among the stars, the glitz, and the glamour, there are those who come to Hollywood to escape their past, an unworthy past. In a city where strangers never attract attention, they can easily blend into the crowd. In 2001, the dreams of one girl would be cut short after a night of bloody crime. Her connection with a famous Hollywood actor would turn her death into a sensation. But this story holds much more. Decades of cat-and-mouse games between the police and a calculating killer. A man whose knife pierced not one, but 4 young women. A serial killer who would become known as the Hollywood Ripper or the Boy Next Door. It happened almost 30 years ago in Glenview, Illinois. But even today, the Picacho family is haunted by memories of the day they learned that Trisha had been brutally murdered. 18-year-old Trisha Picacho had just graduated from high school. On an unusually cool and foggy Friday evening, August 13, 1993, Trisha and her school friends gathered to play a scavenger hunt. Then they all had dinner at a restaurant. Essentially, it was their last meeting before the young people started their university education. After a pleasant evening, the girl returned home a little after 1 in the morning. Holding her keys in her hand, she approached the door, intending to open it, but she never managed to do so. The next morning, her father woke up as usual, brewed himself a cup of coffee, and went outside to his van. The cup fell from his hand when his eyes were confronted with a scene too horrific to describe in words. He fell to his knees before his daughter and screamed. His scream echoed down the cul-de-sac, alarming all the neighbors. Despite the apparent futility of his efforts, Trisha's father tried to provide first aid to bring her back to life. When Trisha's mother learned what had happened, she fainted. Later, both parents were taken to the hospital in a state of shock. The police immediately began an investigation. Trisha had obviously been attacked, her arm twisted so severely that it broke, and she had received multiple stab wounds. But who could have wished such a death upon an 18-year-old girl loved by many? The investigators did their utmost, but a year after the murder, they had made no progress. However, about 12 months after Trisha's death, a neighbor's boy began attracting attention with his strange behavior. 17-year-old Michael Gargiulo was the best friend of Trisha's brother, Doug Picacho. Right after the incident, his reaction was quite natural. The boy was in shock over the murder of the neighbor girl he personally knew. He practically grew up in the Picacho house, often having dinner with the family. And just 2 days before her murder, Michael and another friend, Olson, had given Trisha a ride to her boyfriend's house. Overall, Michael was just a quiet guy to the Picacho family, a friend of their son who had never shown any oddities. But a year after Trisha's murder, the teenager started giving gifts to the family. It started with flowers he brought to Trisha's mother. Then he gave her and her husband a gift certificate for a restaurant dinner. And later, he bought Trisha's father a shirt. This was enough for detectives Jack Reed and Mark Baldwin from Cook County, Illinois, to take a closer look at the boy. A psychologist suggested that with these gifts, he was trying to atone for some sin. The detectives learned that Gargiulo had previously been involved in theft. Then Trisha's brother told the police about an interesting conversation he had with Michael. Michael once asked him if he knew who attacked Trisha. Would he be able to kill him? Doug said that the answer was known to any father or brother of a murdered girl. After this conversation, a detective called Doug and said that according to Michael, Doug had threatened him. It seemed that Michael at least knew more than he was saying, and when he was invited for a conversation at the station, he admitted that the morning after the murder, their mutual friend Eric Agazim had come to him and asked for help hiding something in his gym bag. Michael insisted he didn't know what was in the bag, but suspected it was the murder weapon, a knife. The detectives believed Michael, and when Agazim refused to talk to the police, he immediately became their main suspect. However, the investigators could not find any evidence against Eric, and the investigation stalled. For several years, there were no developments in the case. But one day, 5 years after Trisha's murder, Michael Gargiulo appeared on the Picacho family's doorstep. Clearly, he was still tormented by what he knew about the case, and he asked Trisha's mother if he could speak with her husband. The man wasn't home, so she let the boy wait for him. When Trisha's father entered the house, he immediately understood from Michael's face that they were in for a serious conversation. But before they could exchange even a few words, the door opened and Michael's father and one of his sisters came in. Without providing any explanation, they just took the boy away with them. Trisha's father immediately contacted the police and said they should talk to Michael again, but they were too late. Michael Gargiulo had left Glenview. Hollywood, 2001. 8 years and thousands of miles from the murder of Trisha Picacho. The bright lights of Hollywood have always attracted the young and beautiful. 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was no exception. For a girl from a small town in Northern California, life in Los Angeles was full of opportunities, new acquaintances, and entertainment. Ashley studied at the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. Naturally, she dreamed of working in the fashion industry. In the meantime, she loved having fun with her close-knit group of friends who always spent time together. One evening, the beautiful and smiling girl caught the eye of a rising Hollywood star, 23-year-old Ashton Kutcher. The young people had crossed paths at parties thrown by mutual friends, so when Ashton invited Ashley out to dinner, no one was surprised. They spoke on the phone and agreed that he would pick her up and they would go to a restaurant together. Ashton arrived at about 10:45 p.m. The lights were on in all the rooms, and the young man confidently knocked on the door, but the girl did not open it. He knocked again, but again there was no response. Ashton thought he was too late. Ashley got upset and left with friends. However, before leaving, he peeked through the window by the door. The apartment was a bit messy, but Ashley had just moved in, and that was quite natural. He also saw red wine spilled on the carpet. Not giving it much thought, Ashton went home. As we know now, it was not wine at all. The body of 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was discovered by her neighbor early Thursday morning. The girl entered the house and almost immediately saw her friend lying on the floor, blue and covered in blood. Fearing that the killer might still be in the house, she ran outside and called emergency services. But she was in vain to hurry. The killer had long since disappeared, and it was too late to help Ashley. Detectives who arrived at the crime scene, Tom Small, were confronted with a gruesome sight. Even after so many years, they clearly remember seeing an enormous amount of blood, with Ashley lying a little further away. They marveled at the rage the killer must have been in to stab her 47 times. But what astonished the detectives even more was what they didn't see, any clues that would tell them which direction to move. Ashley's friends provided the detectives with one and only one hint in this case, telling them about a young man who had lived next door to Ashley a few months ago. He introduced himself to her as Michael, a heating and air conditioning repairman. When Ashley's friend's heater broke, they invited Michael over. When he appeared at their house, the young man mentioned that he was a professional boxer, but when he first arrived in Hollywood in 1998, like many other young people, he nurtured another dream, to make it big on the screen. Quite quickly, he achieved a certain level of success in this field, landing a small role as a boxer in 1999. He handled it excellently, but something strange happened behind the camera. He behaved distantly, maybe even a bit shy, and didn't talk to anyone, keeping to himself. He seemed to have two sides to his personality. On one side, he was a clumsy guy with a lot of insecurities, but upon closer acquaintance, it became clear, if he wanted something, he would achieve it at any cost, shutting off all emotions. Michael had even once been arrested for theft, and it was this manner of behavior that puzzled Ashley and her friends. Ashley was a beauty, always open to communication, but Michael never invited her on a date or flirted with her. It seemed as if he was interested not in her, but in the lifestyle she led. Hanging out with actors like Vin Diesel and Jeremy Sisto, he became fixated on her. This wasn't particularly strange in itself, but one time, Ashley's friend Justin caught Michael sitting in his car at night across from her house, watching her apartment. The next day, when Michael dropped by, Justin directly asked him what it all meant. Michael's response shocked him. He allegedly couldn't go home because FBI agents from Chicago were waiting there to take DNA samples from him in connection with the murder of his best friend's girlfriend. Naturally, Justin suggested that Michael give a DNA sample if he had nothing to hide. Unexpectedly, Michael put his foot on the couch and showed a knife in a sheath, hinting that he was involved in the murder. Justin got angry and kicked the guy out of the house. Ashley and her friends brushed off Michael's story as another one of his tall tales. But what no one knew at the time was that it was true. Besides being an aspiring actor, amateur boxer, and heating repairman, Michael Gargiulo was also the prime suspect in the murder of Trisha Picacho. When Michael Gargiulo left Chicago, Illinois, he surely thought he was leaving the murder of Trisha far behind. But wherever he went, a new body would appear. In 2005, 12 years after Trisha's murder and 4 years after Ashley's death, Gargiulo was living in the Los Angeles suburb of El Monte. By this time, the cases of both Ashley and Trisha had been largely forgotten, but by a sinister twist of fate, yet another young woman was found dead in her apartment just steps away from Gargiulo's new residence. 32-year-old Maria Bruno had come to the United States from El Salvador and married young. Maria and her husband were raising 2 children aged 4 and 5, and 1 set of twins when they made the difficult decision to separate. The children stayed with their father while Maria adjusted to her new life. One fateful day, an unknown assailant removed the protective screen from the kitchen window of her ground-floor apartment, grabbed a knife right there on the spot, and entered the bedroom where she was peacefully sleeping. A woman of delicate build, defenseless, she lay asleep in the bedroom of her apartment, the very place where she should have felt completely safe. This attack was a nightmare for any woman, but it also became a nightmare for any detective because the perpetrator left behind a horrific scene. The ferocity with which the unknown attacker assaulted Maria was phenomenal. Investigators quickly ruled out robbery and a sexual motive. As with Ashley, Maria had no enemies capable of such an act. But this time, the assailant left something behind. Near the apartment, forensic experts found a booty with a drop of Maria's blood and an unknown person's DNA on it. This was both a clue and a dead end. No other evidence was found. Detectives, Mark Littlefield, immediately realized that investigating this case would be challenging. What they couldn't know at that moment was that another woman would have to face the killer to solve this crime. On April 28th at 12:30 a.m., a call came into the police reporting a stabbing. The victim was 26-year-old Michelle Murphy. On that day, she was alone in her apartment because her roommate was away. The story of what she went through sounds eerily familiar, but this woman was not ready to give up without a fight. At around 11:40 p.m., an intruder entered her apartment through a slightly open window. Once inside, he opened the front door, preparing an escape route. He then calmly walked to the bedroom. The man simply began stabbing Michelle, managing to strike her several times in the chest, shoulder, and right arm. Michelle woke up to the blows being inflicted by the intruder looming over her. For a moment, she didn't know whether it was a dream or if it was really happening. Realizing that she was in mortal danger, she tried to wrest the knife from him. She continued to attempt to grab the weapon, even as her hands bled from deep wounds. For a while, Michelle and the intruder struggled until she managed to pull her legs up to her chest and push him away. Understanding that he couldn't overpower Michelle, the intruder fled, not forgetting to say, "I'm sorry," before leaving. The perpetrator managed to escape before the police arrived, but during the struggle with Michelle, he cut himself with his own knife, leaving a long trail of blood as he fled. About 25 days after the detective sent the blood sample to the lab, forensic experts reported a DNA match. The DNA matched Michael Gargiulo perfectly. Within 24 hours, Gargiulo was arrested and charged with attempted murder. What stunned the detectives was where he lived, right across the street from Michelle. But Gargiulo's arrest for the attack on Michelle was only the beginning. The investigation would finally connect a series of unsolved murders that had begun 15 years earlier. It was evident that Michael Gargiulo wasn't particularly surprised when he was arrested by Sergeant Richard Lewis for the attempted murder of Michelle on the evening of June 6, 2008, as he specifically asked which department the officers represented. The fact that he wasn't sure which crime he was being arrested for was intriguing in itself. His question had a basis, as Michael Gargiulo's DNA had been found in the national database. It was entered there by the Cook County Police in Illinois. The Santa Monica detectives contacted Illinois investigators to find out why they had done so and learned that Gargiulo was suspected of murder. The Santa Monica investigators discovered that in 2002, Cook County Police, who had continued to investigate the Trisha Picacho case, asked the Los Angeles police for help in obtaining Michael's DNA. By an amazing coincidence, they approached Detective Tom Small, who was investigating Gargiulo's involvement in the murder of Ashley Ellerin. It took the detective over a year to locate the elusive air conditioning repairman, linking him to Trisha's case. And 5 years later, that very DNA sample would help connect Gargiulo to the attack in Santa Monica. But that was far from the end of the story. The Santa Monica investigators called the El Monte police, suspecting that the attack on Michelle might be related to the murder of Maria Bruno. The El Monte detectives returned to Gargiulo's old apartment to search it and found the missing shoe cover. The unknown DNA found on one shoe cover also matched Gargiulo. With the necessary evidence in hand, the detectives had no doubt about the identity of the killer. The Los Angeles prosecutor decided that there was enough evidence to start a case against Michael Gargiulo. On September 4, 2008, while Mike was in jail for the attack in Santa Monica, he was charged with the additional murders of Ashley and Maria. However, the California investigators could not find an answer to one question. Why didn't the Cook County Police in Illinois arrest him years ago for Trisha's murder, thus preventing the deaths of 2 more girls? After all, in 2003, the police had linked the DNA sample obtained by Los Angeles detectives to the unknown DNA found under Trisha's nails. These were the pieces of evidence that could have helped arrest him. Even Trisha's family was confident that this was solid evidence, but the prosecutor decided not to open the case, arguing that the DNA alone was not enough to prove that Gargiulo was at the crime scene when Trisha was attacked. The DNA could have been left not only during the struggle for her life, but also after a casual touch. Mike was a family friend and often visited the house, which was the main obstacle in accusing Mike of Trisha's murder. The prosecutor's office explained that since the lab used one swab to collect DNA from Trisha's nails, it was impossible to determine whether the DNA was on the nails or under them. The difference in this case was enormous. A simple but evidently imperfect laboratory procedure tied the prosecutor's hands. Michael wasn't charged with Trisha's murder until 2011, when a man who worked as a bouncer at a Los Angeles nightclub with Gargiulo recalled seeing him in the news and remembered that Gargiulo had boasted to him and another club employee about killing a girl in Chicago. Gargiulo did not mince words, describing how he committed the crime and allowed her father to find her on the doorstep. After receiving the men's testimonies, the Illinois prosecutor charged Michael Gargiulo with Trisha's murder. This was the news the Picacho family had been waiting to hear for 18 years. It didn't ease their pain, but the thought that the guilty party would be punished brought some relief. Gargiulo, evidently doubting that he would be found innocent, planned to escape from El Monte jail. He made makeshift handcuffs out of plastic and intended to attack a guard, steal a police car, and flee to Mexico. However, his plan failed, and he spent several years in Los Angeles jail awaiting trial. After several delays, the trial began on May 2, 2019. It lasted 3.5 months, with over 200 people testifying. Among them was Ashton Kutcher, who recounted the night 18 years ago when he arrived at Ashley Ellerin's door moments after she had been killed. Kutcher testified clearly and directly. He had met Ashley 2 months earlier at a friend's party. At that time, he was in a relationship, but by the time Ashley invited him to her housewarming party 2 weeks later, he had broken up with his girlfriend. Ashley was also single, so Ashton asked her out to dinner. He arrived at her place quite late because he had been watching the Grammy Awards with friends. When Ashley didn't open the door, he simply went home. Upon learning that she had been murdered, Ashton immediately called the police and informed them that his fingerprints were on her door. Michelle Murphy also testified. She recalled the night of the attack and then spoke about the immense happiness she felt when she became a mother after everything that had happened. However, all she could think about were the parents of Trisha, Ashley, and Maria, whose daughters had been so heartlessly taken from them by this monster. After giving her testimony, she went downstairs to her husband, hugged him, and cried. Gargiulo's lawyer built his defense on the claim that his client was mentally ill and did not understand what he was doing. However, the prosecution proved that Gargiulo had stalked his victims for a long time, waited for the right moment to attack, and planned each assault meticulously, knowing how to avoid punishment. This indicated that he knew exactly what he was doing. Additionally, a former friend of Michael's testified that Gargiulo frequently searched the internet for information on forensics and how to evade punishment for crimes. The prosecutor argued that there was indeed an intimate component to his attacks, even though he did not sexually assault the women. It was the killings themselves that brought him pleasure. On August 15, 2019, Michael Gargiulo was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On July 16, 2021, he was sentenced to the highest penalty. He will be extradited to Illinois, where he will face trial for the murder of Trisha Picacho. In Illinois, the punishment for first-degree murder ranges from 25 years to life imprisonment. The psychologist who was asked to analyze Gargiulo's attacks stated that the similarities between the crimes allowed for identifying the characteristic features of his murders. First and foremost, there was the audacity of the attacks. He did not strike in the dead of night but chose times when neighbors or passers-by could see him. Additionally, attacking with a knife involved very close contact, allowing him to look his victims in the eyes. What he did to the young women allowed him to strip them of their identity and humiliate their human dignity. The psychologist suggests that since they were neighbors and he could frequently observe the beautiful women, he put them on a pedestal. At the same time, he harbored a kind of contempt for them because he desired them, which gave the women power over him. Gargiulo felt the need to rectify this situation. He believed he could regain control only in the most horrifying way, not just by killing them, but by stripping away all their humanity. During one of the interrogations, Michael remarked that just because 10 women were killed and his DNA was found on them, it didn't mean he had killed anyone. This statement, along with testimonies from other witnesses, led the police to suspect that Michael might be responsible for the deaths of 10 people, even though he is officially accused of only 4 attacks. Since Michael Gargiulo traveled between Illinois and California, detectives believe there could be more victims. 1990. 31-year-old Peggy Marshall was at the peak of her career. Armed with a degree in physical therapy, she founded a geriatric clinic in Newport Beach, California. Peggy was passionate about her work, enjoying helping her elderly patients, but what she truly longed for was love. Her dream came true that same year when she met 24-year-old volleyball player Eric Beckler. Peggy and Eric both loved sports, which became their shared passion. Just a few months after meeting, they became inseparable. They lived together in Peggy's apartment and worked together at her clinic. Eric handled the finances, while Peggy provided physical therapy services. Together they made a great team, and the business quickly grew, along with their bank account. Before this, Eric didn't have much of a career, but thanks to his girlfriend, his financial situation improved dramatically, and he enjoyed a stable and wonderful life in a great neighborhood. Soon after their magical wedding ceremony, Peggy Beckler learned that she was expecting a child. But the growing family didn't significantly change their lifestyle. The couple simply brought their daughter with them to the beach. Not long after their first child, a second arrived, and the family moved into a beautiful home they bought for $1 million. They hired 2 nannies, one for weekdays and one for weekends, especially since a third child had arrived. This was the big family Peggy had always dreamed of, like the one she grew up in herself. Thus, the 5th anniversary of the Becklers' marriage quietly arrived. On July 6, 1997, Gary Green, along with a large group of friends and family, was heading from Newport Beach to Catalina Island on his boat when he noticed a boat circling in the ocean. Nearby, a man on a surfboard was struggling in the water, calling for help. Gary Green threw him a life jacket to keep him from drowning and called the Coast Guard. When they arrived, they saw the boat displaying a phenomenon known as the Circle of Death. This happens when the person controlling the boat lets go of the steering mechanism while the engine is running and the propeller is still spinning. Ideally, the operator should be connected to a safety lanyard, which would immediately shut off the engine if they were thrown overboard. However, people often ignore this rule. So when the steering mechanism is released, the force of the spinning propeller creates torque, causing the boat to make sharp turns and continuously rotate in a circle. The Coast Guard was able to stop the boat. They also pulled the man from the water and brought him back to the harbor. He was freezing, panicked, and in tears. The man was Eric Beckler, and his wife, Peggy Beckler, had been on the boat with him. A rescue operation for Peggy immediately began. At that point, she had been in the water for less than 2 hours, and the Coast Guard was hopeful that the rescue would be successful. Peggy was an extraordinarily strong swimmer. At an early age, she was diagnosed with scoliosis and had to wear a back brace. She was only allowed to take it off while swimming, so she spent a lot of time in the water. Swimming became second nature to her. There was a very high chance that Peggy was at least keeping herself afloat while they searched for her. The key was to pinpoint her location as accurately as possible. To aid the rescue operation, the Coast Guard spoke with Eric. He was distraught, shaking, and crying, but he managed to explain that they had been celebrating Peggy's birthday and their 5th wedding anniversary that day. In the morning, he woke his wife up and announced that they were going to the beach. There, a surprise awaited her. Eric had rented a speedboat with a fairly powerful engine. However, it was easy to handle, even for beginners. The couple initially planned to swim in the harbor but soon grew bolder and ventured farther into the ocean for some excitement. For a couple with no experience in ocean boating, renting a speedboat and heading out into the ocean was quite ambitious. But they were enjoying their time. They had a picnic, drank margaritas, and made love. Eventually, they decided to head back. Peggy was at the helm, while Eric wanted to take one more ride on a boogie board. This type of surfing involves catching a wave while lying on your stomach on a relatively small board. As they approached the harbor, they were hit by what's known as a rogue wave or a killer wave, which completely engulfed Eric. When he resurfaced, Peggy was no longer on the boat. The boat itself was circling, making it impossible to get close. He couldn't swim away either, as he was still hoping to see Peggy on the water's surface. The Coast Guard officers were slightly puzzled by the fact that the weather conditions that day were surprisingly favorable for a sea trip. There were no waves and only a light breeze. They mentioned this to Eric, but he stood by his story. The investigators didn't argue. Although there had been no reports of rogue waves, they could have gone unnoticed. The ocean is an unpredictable place. Even in calm weather, many factors, wind, currents, tides, can combine to form unexpected, sometimes deadly waves. Hours passed. Evening came. But the Coast Guard helicopters and boats continued to search for Peggy. Even Navy submarines joined the search efforts. As night fell, confidence in a successful rescue began to fade. If the current had carried her away, she could have ended up in Santa Barbara or even Mexico. Peggy Beckler was searched for relentlessly for several days, but in the end, the difficult decision was made to call off the search. The Coast Guard focused on examining the boat. First, they made sure there were no mechanical issues that could have caused the accident. Then, they tried to recreate the situation the couple had been in. All the experiments showed that no matter how the boat rocked, the person steering it should have fallen inside the boat, not into the water. There was another odd detail. A pair of sunglasses was found near the steering mechanism. If Peggy had been swept away by a wave, the glasses should have fallen overboard, along with other items which should have been in disarray, but nothing of the sort was observed. Suspicion grew, and the Coast Guard asked the Homicide Investigation Department to look into the case. It was only later that forensic experts examined the boat. However, since the Coast Guard initially treated the case as an accident, most of the evidence had been lost. Under the mattress, the investigators found a small stain that looked like blood. The amount was too small to extract DNA or even determine the blood type. They couldn't even confirm if it was human blood or from a fish. Nevertheless, this didn't stop the investigators from questioning Eric about the discovery. Eric explained that his wife was on her period, and since they had been intimate, something could have gotten on the mattress. A reasonable explanation, but the detectives weren't ready to take his word for it. The boat was treated with luminol to detect traces of blood, and they found a whole pool of blood that had been carefully cleaned. It was invisible to the naked eye. Unfortunately, too much time had passed, and it was now impossible to determine when the blood had appeared or who had cleaned it up. Besides, Eric seemed so distraught over his wife's disappearance. No one believed that he could have killed his beloved wife. Moreover, there was another theory regarding her disappearance. Peggy and Eric had been spending too much money. Eric hadn't made mortgage payments on their home for several months, and their financial situation had deteriorated. But at that moment, Peggy caught a lucky break. She was approached by representatives of another company interested in buying her clinic because it had achieved great success. Peggy was faced with a tough choice. She didn't want to sell her clinic for any amount of money, as it was her life's work. However, her husband felt differently. He wanted to get rid of all their problems and difficulties, take the money, and not work. After giving in to his persuasion, Peggy agreed to sell the business. But luckily for her, the new bosses wanted both her and her husband to stay and continue working at the clinic. This was a great solution for them, but the situation didn't last long. The new owners uncovered fraudulent schemes through which the clinic had been receiving money from insurance companies for services it hadn't provided. During the period in question, Eric had been handling the finances, but his wife, as the clinic owner, took the fall. The new owners found this unacceptable and fired both of them. But losing her job wasn't the worst part for Peggy. Her clinic had been draining money from medical insurance providers for years, and someone had to be held accountable. She was facing charges of fraud and tax evasion. These are federal charges, and theoretically she could have faced 10 to 15 years in prison. Peggy confessed all this to Eric's mother, Linda. This is why Linda was convinced that Peggy had staged her own disappearance. She believed that Peggy, being a strong swimmer, had jumped overboard, easily swum to shore, and then settled somewhere in Morocco or the Caribbean. Linda thought Peggy would only return once the statute of limitations on the federal charges expired. At first, Eric's actions seemed to confirm her suspicions. He recovered surprisingly quickly after his wife's disappearance. He then sent their 3 young children to live with Peggy's parents, giving them full custody. But if anyone thought that Eric would soon try to disappear and join Peggy, they were mistaken. Just 3 months after his wife's disappearance, Eric was already dating someone new. Her name was Tina New, a model and actress who appeared in TV shows. As Eric quickly ran out of money, he decided to become a web designer. To promote his company, he planned to participate in a professional expo. He needed a model to attract attention, and a photographer friend from his volleyball team recommended Tina, whom he knew. The two hit it off right away. When Tina met Eric, she was struggling with substance abuse. Her car was in the shop, her home had no electricity due to unpaid bills, and the job offer from Eric came at just the right time. In her eyes, he seemed like a hero, a successful young businessman, so polite and courteous. So when he invited her to come home with him that same evening, Tina agreed. Eric's home was luxurious, with ocean views from every window. Almost every wall in every room was covered with family photos, many of them featuring Peggy. Eric didn't hide what had happened to his wife from Tina. Overall, he seemed like a perfect prince to her. So when the police contacted her to inform her that there was something suspicious about his wife's disappearance and asked her to inform them if she learned anything, Tina didn't believe them. The detectives left her their card, confident that once the initial charm wore off, she would call them, and they were right. Eric's new business failed after just a year, and he was catastrophically short of money to maintain the lifestyle he was used to. He lost his home, and he and Tina moved into a modest apartment. He also tried playing the stock market, but things didn't go well for him there either. The creditors were calling non-stop. Their relationship deteriorated significantly. They fought, reconciled, and fought again. It was October 1999. More than 2 years had passed since Peggy's disappearance. Tina and Eric had a fight so loud that the neighbors called the police. When the officers arrived, Eric was not in the apartment, and Tina handed them the detective's business card, asking them to call him. She told the arriving detectives that when they last spoke, she and Eric had just started dating. She was in love with him and believed the story he had told her. But now, she was certain that Eric had killed his wife. Tina told the detectives that a few weeks earlier, she and Eric had been at home, and she was watching old television shows that featured her. While fast-forwarding through the commercials, she suddenly stopped on a segment that had somehow been recorded. It was a news segment about the disappearance of Peggy Beckler. The news report discussed the water current and the weather on that day, which was completely inconsistent with what Eric had told her. Tina looked at him and said, "You lied to me." The blood drained from his face. He turned pale. Eric admitted that he had seen his wife fall overboard but hadn't been able to swim to her in time. Tina asked if he couldn't or didn't want to. He replied, "I couldn't." Then he thoughtfully added, "Or maybe I didn't want to." A bad feeling began to creep over Tina, but she decided to brush the conversation aside. A couple of weeks later, Tina and Eric were relaxing at a club where they were using illegal substances. When they returned home, they were lying in bed, still not fully recovered, when Tina suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my God, you hit her in the head." She didn't even understand why she realized this so clearly. Eric even jumped. He asked, "How do you know that?" But she didn't know until he confirmed it with those words. Tina demanded to know how it all happened. It turned out that the day before the boating trip, Eric had prepared a cooler, dumbbells, trash bags, and everything needed for margaritas. Eric told Peggy that it was a surprise, so she didn't even look into the bag. They went out into the ocean. Peggy was just lying there, relaxing, sunbathing, when her husband approached her from behind and, according to him, hit her so hard that she didn't even feel it. Then the murderer folded his wife's body in half, tied her ankles, wrists, and neck together, put 2 trash bags on Peggy, and dumped her into the water with a weight of 30 kilograms. After that, he returned to the boat several kilometers closer to shore. This meant that the Coast Guard, helicopters, and submarines were all searching for Peggy in the wrong place. Tina told the police all of this, but her words weren't enough for even an arrest of Eric because she could simply be making false accusations against her ex-boyfriend. However, this wasn't the first time detectives had heard similar allegations against Eric. They had heard the same from his best friend, Kobe Laker. A few months after the boating incident, Eric's friend Kobe Laker went to the police with a lawyer. Kobe had already been questioned before, but now he confessed that he had lied when he told the police that the couple had a perfect relationship. Eric had repeatedly confessed to his friend that he was fed up with his wife and could no longer tolerate her. Eric considered his wife controlling and demanding. On the other hand, she was carrying the weight of the children and the business, while he just wanted to play volleyball with his friends. She brought money into the household and he was happy to spend it. All of this Eric had shared with Kobe. One day, Eric directly asked his friend what he would think if Eric killed his wife. Allegedly, Eric was considering taking her out into the ocean and dumping her in the water in a barrel or something similar. When Kobe regained his speech, he asked if he was joking, and Eric replied, "Maybe." Kobe stated that he hadn't mentioned this before because he was scared and wanted to protect his friend. Thanks to the young man's testimony, the police officially classified the case as a homicide. But without physical evidence, including the victim's body, investigators couldn't proceed. They needed to get Eric to confess on tape. Kobe agreed to wear a recording device and meet with Eric, but he couldn't get his friend to open up. Eric remained calm and insisted that Peggy had indeed had an accident. The police had only Kobe's word against Eric's. That wasn't enough for an arrest. By the time Kobe testified, the police had long given up on the idea that Peggy had faked her disappearance to avoid fraud charges. In reality, she faced a maximum fine, not prison time, so it was unlikely she would have abandoned her beloved husband and children to hide in another country. Therefore, the police now suggested that Tina try to get Eric to talk so they could record his words and arrest him. She agreed because she was openly afraid of her boyfriend. On October 29, 1999, the police placed a listening device on the girl's back and another in her handbag. Tina and Eric met at a restaurant, with detectives positioned both inside the restaurant and outside in the parking lot. The girl was supposed to act confidently, but she was afraid that Eric would hug her and feel the device on her. Eric and Tina had a couple of cocktails, after which Tina got down to business. She told Eric that the police had come to her asking questions about Peggy's disappearance, so they needed to agree on how she would respond. The man simply replied that she hadn't been on the boat. That was all she needed to say. But that answer didn't satisfy Tina. She had always known that if anyone could get Eric to talk, it would be her. So she asked how it had come to this. Why didn't he just divorce his wife? Eric replied that he would lose money in a divorce and would never see his children again. His wife would take them away and wouldn't let him see them. But who was he fooling? Tina knew very well that as soon as Peggy disappeared, he had given custody of the children to her parents. Still, that was something. Tina continued to press. She asked how she could be sure he wouldn't do something similar to her if they continued to date, to which he replied that he would never do that again. This was not enough, but still sufficient for Eric's arrest. The detectives, of course, did not hear a confession from him because he demanded a lawyer, but when they searched him, they found a weight bench that was missing only the 15-kilogram weights. Together, they accounted for the 30 kilograms he had mentioned to Tina. The trial began. This was a unique case because the prosecution had no physical evidence of the man's crime or that Peggy was even dead. Moreover, Eric acted very cleverly, confirming that during his conversation with Tina, he meant the murder of his wife. However, he claimed that she liked bad boys and that he was trying to create that image. The prosecutor was well prepared and used all circumstantial evidence to convincingly demonstrate his version of the events of that day. Furthermore, the motive for the murder was indisputable and as old as time. Both spouses were insured for more than $2.5 million. Today, that would be the equivalent of nearly $4 million. This issue clearly concerned Eric because 3 months before Peggy's disappearance, he called her brother to inquire about the money. He wanted to know more about the policies and how the payout would work if something happened to his wife. Interestingly, a month and a half before her death, Peggy wanted to change the beneficiary of the insurance. She intended to exclude Eric so that the money would go only to the children. This indicates how little she trusted her husband in her final days. Of course, Eric did not receive the insurance payout anyway, because insurance companies are very reluctant to pay money to potential suspects. After 7 days of deliberation on February 1, 2001, Eric was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. After his wife's death, Eric did not receive the insurance money. Instead, he lost his home and income, and his new business failed. Indeed, Peggy was far more valuable to her husband alive. She was his ticket to a luxurious life, and even in the case of a divorce, he would have gained more than nothing. But evidently, he did not understand that. Not to mention the fact that murder itself is a terrible crime. Overall, he did not act very sensibly. No wonder his volleyball buddy said he must have had an accomplice because he was too foolish to come up with everything on his own. Not to mention that the police had no evidence, but his long tongue led to him spending the rest of his life in prison instead of playing volleyball on the beach. Monday, May 2nd, 2005, the police station in the French town of Egmore. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, an officer answered a call that seemed strange to him, to say the least. On the line was an informant claiming that something terrible might happen to a young woman in a few hours. The informant explained that a couple was sitting at a table on the terrace of the Resales bar in Egmort, and the police needed to act immediately because her companion was extremely dangerous. The officer who answered the call heard a panicked voice on the other end shout, "The man who just left me is planning to abduct a girl. He's dangerous, and I think he's going to do something terrible." The caller was 63-year-old local resident Dominique Tarasco. Tarasco's voice trembled as he told the police about a conversation he had with a friend earlier that day. His friend was a cruel and dangerous man, and from their conversation, Tarasco deduced that he intended to harm a young girl. The police tried to obtain more information from Dominique, what his friend looked like, his name, who they should be looking for. However, despite his initial willingness to help, Tarasco refused to reveal his friend's name, stating that he feared for his own life. No promise of protection could compel him to disclose the name. However, he did provide the police with the location where his friend was supposed to meet. He said his friend would meet an unsuspecting girl on the terrace of the Resales bar. Tarasco also gave the police a description of his friend's car, a green 1994 Seat Ibiza. Time was running out rapidly. If an abduction was planned, the police didn't have time to extract more information from Tarasco. 4 officers got into 2 cars and immediately headed to the bar. They arrived at the establishment around 6:15 p.m. The police turned off their sirens and pretended to be just enjoying themselves at the bar. It was crucial not to spook the suspect. However, they quickly realized that trying to find unknown abductors and the girl was nearly impossible. It was the last evening of a 3-day weekend, and the streets, as well as the bar's terrace, were crowded with couples having a good time. None of the girls appeared frightened. Not knowing whom to look for, 2 officers started scanning for the Seat Ibiza. An hour passed, but the police couldn't find the couple or the car. Detectives began to wonder if Dominique had been mistaken. They called him to clarify the details he had provided. Suddenly, Dominique's heart sank. He realized that he had described the wrong car. In reality, his friend drove a gray 1994 Citroën ZX. The police were incredibly frustrated that they had been searching for the wrong vehicle while the Citroën might have slipped right under their noses, and they wouldn't even have noticed. After another thorough search, they confirmed that they couldn't see the needed car anywhere. The race against time to save the girl came to a forced halt. The police were at a dead end. Since Dominique refused to provide more information, there was nothing they could do. The officers returned to the station and checked if there were any reports of missing local girls, but there were none. Dominique had given the police incomplete and inaccurate information. A logical question arises. Why did they believe him in the first place? Dominique Tarasco was known to the local police. Officially, he was involved in collecting recyclables, but unofficially, he was the owner of an illegal nightclub near Egmort. The seemingly simple wooden shed housed a popular establishment frequented by both local celebrities and less reputable individuals. The police wanted to shut down the illegal club, but Tarasco managed to strike a deal with them. He had become a police informant, and in exchange, law enforcement turned a blind eye to his business. Tarasco had already been of great use to the police, providing them with information about impending crimes that had led to several arrests. However, none of these cases had been as serious as a human abduction. 2 days later, a 25-year-old man named Sylvain Rosin walked into the police station in Marseille, 180 kilometers from Egmore. Sylvain was extremely worried as he had been unable to contact his wife, Elodie Morel, for 2 days. She had left home to meet with a well-known photographer in Egmore. Sylvain explained that 28-year-old Elodie had worked as a waitress in bars and restaurants for most of her life, but she had grown tired of long night shifts, unpredictable working hours, low pay, and difficult customers. Given her interest in the fashion industry and natural beauty, she decided to pursue her long-standing dream of becoming a model. In April 2005, she registered on a website for people aspiring to work in the fashion industry. Elodie applied for any modeling job she could find, and then she came across an incredibly enticing offer. Renowned photographer Nicole Forestier was looking for models to represent Rolls-Royce. The photo shoot was scheduled to last for 5 days, and the 3 selected models would receive €1,000 for each shooting day, with expenses for food, accommodation, and transportation covered. Furthermore, the girls who impressed would travel to the United States as representatives of Rolls-Royce. This was Elodie's dream job, and she understood that her chances were slim with fierce competition ahead. Nevertheless, she submitted her application to participate in the competition. Prepared for rejection, she was overjoyed when Nicole wrote to her, informing her that she had secured the job. The photographer explained that Elodie had precisely the look she was seeking. When Sylvain heard that Elodie had been chosen as one of the 3 models for the photo shoot, her enthusiasm became infectious, although he did wonder if this could be a trap set by people preying on young, attractive girls. The police asked Sylvain why he allowed his wife to meet with the photographer in the first place, and he replied that he trusted his wife, who was an intelligent woman and would not fall for a foolish trick. Moreover, he felt that a meeting with a woman in a public place in the middle of the day couldn't hold any danger. The last message Sylvain received from his wife came on May 2nd at 9:30 p.m., a few hours after her meeting with the photographer. It read, "Kisses, everything is going fine. I'll call you tomorrow when I can. Kisses and hugs. We'll talk later." While the police spoke with Sylvain, they sensed that he might be hiding something. He tried to evade their questions, but eventually confessed that he and his wife had been arguing frequently recently and had even decided to separate, although they continued living together for the sake of their son. The police believed that the couple's relationship and Elodie's last message suggested that she might have chosen not to contact her husband voluntarily. However, Sylvain insisted that there was no reason for his wife to conceal a new romance, if there was one, and that she would never, ever abandon their son. She had always wanted their son to grow up in a loving family, something she herself had lacked in her childhood. The police had no doubts that there could be a million innocent reasons why the young woman hadn't been in touch with her husband. Perhaps she had no cell phone signal, or she had lost her phone. However, Sylvain insisted that something needed to be done. Finally, the Marseille police relented, compiled a report with Elodie's description and where she was last seen, and sent it to other police stations. The police in Aigues-Mortes continued to investigate missing persons reports, hoping to find any connection to the story Dominique Tarasco had shared 2 days earlier. When a fax arrived from the Marseille police detailing Elodie Morel's disappearance, the detectives couldn't help but feel uneasy. Elodie's last known location was Aigues-Mortes on May 2nd, and she had a meeting with an unknown individual at a bar around 6 p.m. The remarkable similarities between Elodie's disappearance and Dominique's potential abduction report couldn't be ignored. Detectives got in touch with Sylvain to gather more information about his wife. When Sylvain described the details of his wife's meeting with the photographer, they matched exactly what the police already knew from Dominique's account. These were the 2 pieces of the same story. Detectives asked Sylvain to come to the Aigues-Mortes police station and bring photos of his spouse. He also provided a description of his wife's car, the clothes she had taken with her, copies of Elodie's correspondence with Nicole Forestier, and his wife's phone number. Calls to the phone were immediately redirected to voicemail, indicating that the phone was either turned off or malfunctioning. However, the police managed to trace the ping from Elodie's phone and determined her location before her mobile went dead. On May 2nd, her phone was in Aigues-Mortes, confirming that she had safely arrived in the city on that day. Later, she was located in the commune of Saint-Gilles, which is 30 kilometers from Aigues-Mortes. This indicated that Elodie was likely on her way to the photo shoot location. Strangely, the signal then came from Vauvert, which is 19 kilometers in the opposite direction. Shortly after appearing in Vauvert, the ping from Elodie's phone disappeared and never reappeared. The police believed that they couldn't conduct a search in Aigues-Mortes, Saint-Gilles, and Vauvert all at once. The area was too extensive. Only one person could help them now, Dominique Tarasco. They asked him to come to the station. He arrived around 8:30 p.m. and shared a story with the detectives that sent shivers down their spines. It was hard for them to believe. On the evening of May 2nd, after Tarasco had called the police to report a possible abduction, he drove into town to have dinner and distract himself from his thoughts. A few hours later, he was returning home along a country road. In the darkness, he noticed flashing blue and red lights. 2 police cars were blocking the road and several officers were standing nearby. Tarasco assumed that the police were conducting a stakeout on the potential kidnapper. He stopped his car and got out to inquire about the progress of the search for the girl. Although he had not disclosed the name of the potential abductor to the detectives, Tarasco hoped that the police had located the man's car. Meanwhile, the officers observed an agitated man approaching them, waving his arms and shouting strange questions. When he got closer, they could tell that he was slightly intoxicated. The man was asking whether they had found the car, arrested the suspect, and if the girl was okay, but the police couldn't make sense of his words. They didn't understand what he was talking about because they were simply conducting a routine check on cars passing along that road. While Tarasco was talking to the police, a car slowly approached them. Dominique instantly recognized the vehicle. It was his friend's gray Citroën ZX from 1994. It was his friend's car. As the officers were preoccupied with Dominique, the car drove past the police vehicles and sped away without being stopped. Tarasco noticed his friend in the driver's seat, and a beautiful, long-haired girl was sitting in the passenger seat. She seemed to be leaning against the window as if asleep. Dominique became extremely uneasy. He began demanding that the police chase after the car and arrest the driver, but they were no longer listening to him. Suddenly, the man's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw that it was his friend, who had just driven past him. Dominique's heart sank, but he managed to answer the call. As it turned out, his friend hadn't noticed him. Instead, he called to warn Dominique about the police presence near his home, advised him to be careful, and then ended the call. When Tarasco recounted this incredible story at the police station, the investigators were shocked. They found it hard to believe. What were the chances that Tarasco had approached the roadblock and effectively distracted the police just as his friend happened to drive by? And why was he only sharing this information now? Tarasco explained that he was terrified of his friend. With a certain degree of skepticism, the investigators contacted the officers who had been conducting the vehicle check that day and managed to confirm that there had indeed been a roadside check that evening. Someone had called Dominique after the gray Citroën ZX had passed by. Everything Tarasco had said was verified. He was telling the truth. His description of the girl in the car perfectly matched Elodie Morel. There was also no doubt about the identity of the driver of the car since Tarasco's friend had called him to warn about the police, and their patience had worn thin. They demanded a name. The investigators threatened Tarasco with imprisonment and pressed him to reveal the identity. Unable to withstand the pressure any longer, Tarasco finally gave in. Tearfully, he uttered the name of the abductor, Guom Mingo. Guom Mingo, 49 years old, had a long history of brushes with the law. He was known for hunting young foreign women traveling by car for his vile purposes. After his release from prison, he visited an old acquaintance and asked for a job. This acquaintance turned out to be Dominique Tarasco. Dominique had no desire to employ such a dangerous person, but fearing Mingo himself, he hired him as a bouncer in his nightclub, where his violent nature could serve some purpose. On May 2nd, Mingo was at Tarasco's establishment, where he boasted about having a meeting with a beautiful girl on the bar's terrace. However, Guillaume's choice of words unsettled Tarasco. Knowing Mingo's proclivities, he felt obliged to inform the police about the impending encounter between a dangerous repeat offender and an unsuspecting girl. Learning of Mingo's criminal history, the police immediately classified him as the prime suspect. However, the case was still based on Tarasco's vague statements and could be dismissed as a series of unlikely coincidences. Detectives needed evidence of Elodie's abduction by Guillaume Mingo. They questioned the bar staff, who confirmed that Mingo was a regular customer and had arrived with a beautiful girl that day. It became increasingly evident that Elodie Morel was in the hands of a very dangerous individual capable of anything. Yet, the detectives had no idea where to find the suspect. Mingo had traveled extensively, often staying with acquaintances or spending nights in nightclubs. He could be anywhere. Therefore, they set up a trap to lure him. Detectives forced Dominique to call Mingo and arrange a meeting. Mingo told Dominique that he would be at a nightclub in Montpellier, a 30-minute drive from Aigues-Mortes. The club was familiar to Mingo as he had once worked there as a bouncer. Officers positioned themselves in the club's parking lot and waited. The plan worked. A white van pulled up, and to the police's surprise, Guillaume Mingo was indeed in the passenger seat. An unknown middle-aged man was driving, but was Elodie inside? Mingo got out of the car and the police immediately moved to apprehend the suspect. The man tried to flee, but they quickly brought him down and arrested him. The driver of the van didn't resist. He introduced himself as Richard Lignier, a nearby resident and construction worker. He had never had any legal troubles and simply wanted to spend a pleasant evening with his acquaintance. The police searched the van, but it turned out to be empty. Elodie was not inside. Mingo's belongings were also searched. In his pockets, they found a phone, car keys, and a wallet. Inside the wallet were some documents, a small amount of money, and a bank card in Elodie Morel's name. However, the man had a ready explanation. He claimed he had found the card on the bar's terrace 2 days ago and intended to return it to the bank the following day, but forgot to do so. As for Lignier, he explained that he lived in the commune of Vergese with his wife and teenage daughter. Mingo had been his friend, and for the past 2 days he had been staying at his house. Mingo allegedly often stayed with Lignier during his travels before setting out again. The detectives had a hard time believing the two men's stories. Mingo's explanation about Elodie's bank card seemed far-fetched, and Lignier lived only 8 kilometers from Vouvray, where the last ping from Elodie's mobile phone had been recorded. The police arrested both men and took them to the station for questioning. However, they made a stop on the way, visiting Richard Lignier's home. When the officers arrived at Lignier's house, they encountered the most bizarre and surreal scene of their careers. Richard's wife, Francine Lignier, and their daughter were seated at the table, having lunch. Neither Francine nor the girl reacted to the uninvited guests at all. They continued to eat in silence, as if a group of police officers had not just burst into their home and started searching the premises. This strange reaction left the detectives astounded, as if they had been expected. An unpleasant and oppressive atmosphere pervaded the family's home. Despite this eerie atmosphere, the police meticulously searched the house while the women continued their meal. Elodie herself was nowhere to be found, but indirect evidence of her presence emerged. A black handbag, a floral dress, 2 pairs of high-heeled shoes, and a black sweater. These were the items Elodie had taken with her on her trip. However, the most crucial piece of evidence was Elodie's phone, which was now in the possession of Lignier's daughter. After making these findings, the police decided to take the mother and daughter to the station for further questioning. Interrogating Mingo proved to be incredibly challenging. He was a master of manipulation and stuck to his story. The police could contradict some of his statements thanks to the evidence they had found, but Mingo insisted that he had simply found the bank card and intended to return it. Period. So the investigators decided to focus more on the Lignier family. They reasoned that it would be easier to get Richard, who had never been in trouble with the law before, to talk than the repeat offender Guillaume Mingo. With each passing hour of questioning, Richard became more exhausted, and the investigators were confident that he was on the verge of revealing everything. As expected, Richard eventually broke down. He confessed that Guillaume Mingo had shown up at his house at 6 a.m. on May 3rd while his family was having breakfast. Mingo claimed to have come with a girl and needed somewhere to hide her. Just a few meters from Richard's house, there was an isolated place, a garage. Richard had no choice but to unlock it and allow Mingo to drive into the garage. I didn't see what was in the trunk. I didn't hear anything. Mingo said he would stay overnight in the garage to make sure she wouldn't scream. Richard asked no further questions, returned to the house, washed up, got dressed, and went to work as usual. But it wasn't an ordinary day. There was a young woman in his garage who could be in great danger. Richard was well aware of how cruel and dangerous Mingo could be, but not once throughout the entire day did he feel the need to contact the police and report what was happening in his garage. After Richard's confession, his wife Francine fully corroborated his account. However, like her husband, she never considered calling the police to report the girl in her garage. She was afraid that by doing so, Mingo would harm her daughter. She added that on the evening of the same day, May 3rd, Mingo entered their house, demanding dinner. He had with him a black bag, a dress, 2 pairs of high-heeled shoes, a sweater, and a phone. He handed the items to Richard and Francine as a gift. Francine took the items without asking questions, while she gave the phone to their daughter, as she happened to need a new one. During lunch, Mingo first mentioned that the girl might report him to the police and hinted at his terrible intentions toward her. Upon learning that Linier had revealed everything to the police, Guillaume Mingo lost confidence in himself and came up with a new version of events. He admitted to posting a fake message online about upcoming photo shoots for Rolls-Royce. He had posed as the renowned photographer Nicole Forestier and provided enough information to make the photo shoot appear credible. Mingo claimed to be genuinely surprised when Elodie responded to the offer and accused her of falling for an offer that was too good to be true. Regardless, Mingo contacted Elodie by phone, introduced himself as Forestier's assistant Alan Lacoste, and invited her to Aigues-Mortes ostensibly to meet Forestier before the shoot began. After meeting Elodie, he proposed going on a trip to the locations where the photo shoot was planned. She agreed and messaged her husband, assuring him that everything was fine. As he had done in the past, Mingo drove Elodie onto a country road. Sensing that they had gone far enough, he attacked her. However, he told the police that all he needed was her bank card and PIN. He claimed that he simply let her go afterward, using her card to make some purchases, refuel his car, and withdraw some cash. This was confirmed by the ATM camera. Mingo denied Linier's claims about the garage and other things. Of course, no one believed that Mingo had lured Elodie to Aigues-Mortes just to steal her bank card. While interrogating him, investigators searched Linier's garage and found several dozen cigarette butts, fingerprints, and DNA evidence from both Guillaume and Elodie. These pieces of evidence confirmed that Elodie had been in the garage with Mingo. Confronted with these facts, Mingo provided yet another version of what happened. He once again claimed that he only needed Elodie's bank card. Supposedly, he did take her to the garage, but it was only to buy some time. He wanted to discuss a plan with Elodie. He would keep her bank card in exchange for her silence. Mingo stated that he was almost ready to release her when she suddenly pushed him. He justified the subsequent violence with his explosive temper. The end of the first week of May was supposed to be the grand finale of the photo shoot for Rolls-Royce. Instead, on May 6th, Mingo was wrapping up his statements about what had occurred. He revealed where he had left Elodie. The police found her black 1995 BMW sedan in the Aigues-Mortes parking lot. The license plates confirmed that it was her car. When detectives opened the trunk, they found Elodie there. She had died from asphyxiation. During the autopsy, more horrifying details of what had happened to Elodie during the harrowing 36 hours she spent in the clutches of her captor, with no one coming to her aid, were uncovered. There's no need to enumerate these details, as one can easily imagine what a criminal of this nature could do to an attractive young woman who had fallen into his trap. Guillaume Mingo, Richard, and Francine Linier faced trial in January 2008. During the trial, Mingo once again mocked the feelings of all Elodie's friends and family. Despite all the evidence gathered and his own confession, he claimed that everything was Richard Linier's fault and that he had fallen in love with Elodie at first sight, so he allegedly couldn't harm her. No one bought into his lies, and in February 2008, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. He filed an appeal which was approved. His sentence was reduced to a maximum of 30 years with a minimum of 20 years in prison. Richard and Francine were initially sentenced to 6 years, but their prison terms were increased to 8 years after a year. Sylvain Racine struggled deeply with what happened to his wife and never publicly commented on the case. Elodie's top priority had been to raise her son in a safe and happy home environment, and Sylvain promised himself that he would do everything possible to ensure that. Dominique Tarasco, who first reported the possible kidnapping to the police, understands that his reluctance to reveal Guillaume Mingo's name hindered the timely rescue of Elodie. He acknowledges that he still regrets not fully cooperating with the police. Dominique believes he could have saved Elodie Morel because he knew enough but didn't act on it. He has never been charged in connection with this case. Robin Hood of the 21st century. Instead of Sherwood Forest, he operated in a gated community in Florida. Instead of a horse, he maneuvered through the city streets in a luxurious Mercedes. But what would remain unchanged is his assistance to those who are far less fortunate in life. And so it continued until one fateful day when the well-established scheme went awry. This story begins on September 8, 2014, in Florida. The previous evening, spouses Nan Yao and Jill Su returned from a trip to Malaysia, where Nan Yao had been giving lectures. In the morning, the entomology professor shook off the fatigue from the flight and headed to work at the University of Florida. Jill allowed herself a bit more sleep, but got up around 9:30 when her 20-year-old son, Justin, also left home. He worked a part-time job as a professor's assistant. Shortly after noon, Justin's father called him. He wanted to confirm if the young man was at home. Justin replied that he was at work. His father called him because he noticed something unusual on the surveillance camera in the house. He asked his son to come back and check if everything was all right because the camera suddenly stopped transmitting images. 15 minutes later, Justin had already parked his car at home, entered through the garage, passed the sleeping dog in the corridor, and first checked a camera near the kitchen. However, the camera was missing, leaving only a dangling cable where it used to be connected. Justin knew that only his mother was in the house, and he couldn't fathom why someone would target her and rip the camera out with its wire. The situation was the same with the camera in the living room. As he walked into his room, Justin immediately noticed someone had been rifling through his belongings. Justin, an avid hunter and diver, collected knives, and some were now missing. He heard the sound of running water in the parents' bathroom and headed there. Upon entering the bathroom, he saw it filled with water and blood. His mother's lifeless body floated face down. Justin immediately thought of his father and called him. Nan Yao instructed his son to contact the rescue service, and Justin complied. He informed the dispatcher that his mother had done something to herself, the most rational explanation given what he saw at that moment. However, pulling his mother out of the water, he realized he had misunderstood everything. Her hands and legs were bound, and her body bore multiple wounds. Still on the line with the dispatcher, Justin declared that a murder had occurred. Rushing home, Nan Yao wanted to embrace and comfort his son, who had started having a fit of hysteria, but the officers did not allow him. Nan Yao was not aware of it, but it was the first sign that the police considered his son a suspect. The reason was that a folding knife belonging to Justin was lying near the front door. Another hunting knife, a gift from the mother to the son, became the murder weapon. The police found it at the bottom of the bathtub. There, the criminal also threw an emergency alarm panel. He took with him 2 surveillance cameras. It was also evident that the family's belongings had been rifled through. In the glass back door of the house, there was a hole the size of a doggy door. However, investigators were confident that it was not a burglary gone wrong, but a staged act, and a clumsy one at that, because the hole seemed too small for an adult to squeeze through, and the criminal took nothing besides the cameras. The police believe that the crime occurred in a fit of rage. Usually when a robber breaks into a house, they do not end up delivering more than 20 blows to the victim. Detectives delved into the lives of the victim's family. Nan Yao and Jill first met in Japan when she came as an exchange student, and he was working as a teacher. Afterward, Nan Yao went to the United States to pursue his doctoral degree, while Jill continued her travels in Southeast Asia. Approximately 2 years later, he received a postcard from her, deeply moved to learn that she was in Thailand, volunteering to aid Cambodian refugees. When she returned to America, the two married and adopted a daughter, Amanda. 3 years later, Justin joined the family. Jill not only remained a wonderful mother to her children, but also found the strength and time for volunteer work. She recorded audiobooks for people with visual impairments. There was no doubt that the Su family members loved each other deeply. However, tension arose in the last few months. Justin dropped out of college, which of course displeased his parents. Yet what intrigued the police even more was Jill Su's maiden name, Halliburton. Earl Halliburton had once been one of the wealthiest individuals in the country, amassing his fortune in the oil industry. When Earl passed away, his wealth was distributed among all family members, but the magnate had so many relatives that Jill, Amanda, and Justin received almost nothing. The Su family's bills were paid not by oil, but by termite control, thanks to Nan Yao's invention of an effective termite trap 30 years ago. Even after Jill's death, her share of the inheritance went to her husband, who considered himself quite affluent. All of Jill and Nan Yao's friends attested that the family lived in love and harmony. Just a few hours after Justin found his mother brutally murdered, he sat in the interrogation room at the police station. Several aspects of his story troubled the investigators. Firstly, how could he not immediately recognize it as murder, given the number of stab wounds inflicted on Jill? Moreover, the murder weapon, a knife, belonged to Justin. It seemed odd that the intruder didn't grab a readily available kitchen knife. Justin showed no signs of a struggle, answered all questions calmly, and did not request a lawyer. He explained to detectives that he left for work around 9:30 a.m., returned home at approximately 12:30 p.m. after his father's call, and initially didn't notice anything unusual. Initially, the officers were calm and delicate with Justin, but the tone of the interrogation quickly shifted to accusatory, especially after catching him in lies. He told his father he was at work on the phone but claimed to be at the college library when talking to the police. He later admitted to lying about that, stating he slept in his car in the parking lot. Justin explained he was worried about how his father would react to him sleeping in the car instead of studying or working, so he lied. Then Justin claimed he took another knife with him when he left the car and returned it later.
Clean, this is your only opportunity.
Oh my God.
You understand?
Your dad.
What? What did I say to my dad? I lied to my dad. I told him I was going to work.
Later, Justin claimed that as he was getting out of the car, he took another knife with him, but then he returned it to its place. So, after discovering Anne's mother, did he go and put the knife in the car? This, of course, was nonsense, and under pressure, Justin admitted that he had lied again. He didn't take any knife with him. However, Justin insisted from the beginning that the intruder broke into the house to steal something and didn't expect to encounter the homeowner. During breaks between interrogations, when investigators consulted with forensic experts about evidence in Nan Yao, Justin ran around the room, shouting, crying, and begging to be released.
Please let me.
He was obviously in shock and couldn't calm down. In the adjacent room, Nan Yao heard his son's agony, but couldn't do anything because it was his turn to answer questions. After all, he was the one who raised the alarm that day. Nan Yao explained that around 12:15, he decided to check the surveillance cameras in the house. Unexpectedly, he saw an unfamiliar person, a fleeting figure in a mask that appeared for just a moment, heading towards the kitchen corner. As soon as the figure disappeared from view, the camera feed was lost. Nan Yao thought it could be his son. Justin sometimes deliberately blocked the cameras so his father couldn't see anything when friends visited, as he did 2 days ago when his parents were in Malaysia. But Justin told his father he was at work. Worried because Jill didn't answer calls, Nan Yao became anxious and asked his son to go home. Essentially, Nan Yao only saw the eyes of the intruder and described him as a tall and slender young man. Detectives couldn't help but notice that Justin fit this description. They seemed to be setting father and son against each other. They pointed out to Nan Yao that Justin matched his description. They told Justin that his father suspected him of murder. However, even when Justin was on edge and unsure of what to believe, Nan Yao never bought into it. Regardless of the tactics the investigators chose, they consistently pressured Justin for 11 grueling hours. But Justin maintained his innocence, requested a polygraph test, and insisted that they would come to apologize when the case was solved.
When you guys find out you're wrong, I hope you come and say sorry to me, man, or something.
If there was anything that could help the young man, it was the image of the intruder seen by his father. However, the hitch was that the Su family had agreed to a 2-week trial period during which recordings from their cameras would be saved, and this period ended exactly 2 days before the crime. As the couple was in Malaysia and likely forgot to renew this service, there were simply no recordings. In other words, Nan Yao saw the real-time image, and when the image disappeared, it was gone forever. However, other detectives reviewed the surveillance camera footage near the entrance of the gated community where the family lived. They confirmed that Justin left at 9:15 and didn't reappear until 3 hours later when he returned home at his father's request. In other words, the murder occurred while Justin was not at home. After hours of accusations and pressure at the police station, they simply opened the door and allowed him to go home. Waiting for him behind the door was his father, who did his best to comfort his son. Unlike the police, he never believed in his son's guilt for a moment. In any case, Justin provided the police with a new lead that opened up an entirely new direction for the investigation. 2 days before the parents returned from Malaysia, Justin organized a party. The company was not very large, about 25 people around the age of 20, but now the list of people to be interrogated significantly increased. They were all invited to the station, and DNA and fingerprints were taken. No one objected. By that time, everyone already knew what had happened to Justin's mother and were willing to help. They mentioned that they were aware of the cameras because Justin had warned them and asked them to behave properly. Almost all the guests were his old friends, but not everyone. Some suggested that the police should pay attention to a guy with a bad reputation who had previously been arrested by the police. When officers arrived at his place, he admitted that he was expecting them. He confirmed that he had been arrested before, but for controlled substances, not robbery. His DNA was already in the database, so he had no problem providing it again. The young man had an alibi, and there were no scratches or signs of struggle on his body. In general, the police spoke with 30 people, and besides this guy, no one had legal issues. It seemed like the investigation was at a standstill, but that was not the case. Throughout this time, forensic experts were comparing DNA found at the crime scene, and after 9 days of investigation, news came from the laboratory. They had a match, and incredibly, the suspect's name was in the database. The DNA belonged to 20-year-old Deonte Resales. Detectives pondered whether there might be an innocent reason for Deonte being in the house. Perhaps he knew Justin, who was a year younger. The detective called Justin and listed 3 names, 2 of which were made up to test him. He didn't recognize any of them, including Deonte. Deonte grew up and lived near the Sioux family home. However, unlike Justin, he was raised by a single mother earning a minimum wage. Deonte was not a typical child. He excelled in school, surprisingly well-read, and teachers loved him. However, by adolescence, he became bored with mundane lessons and got involved with a bad crowd. By the age of 18, he had been arrested 8 times, mostly for robberies. His modus operandi sounded familiar to the detectives. He would rent expensive cars and disguise himself to explain his presence in affluent neighborhoods. Deonte targeted luxurious mansions in gated communities near the water, infiltrating homes through openings in rear glass doors and disabling surveillance cameras when possible. However, he never attacked the homeowners. If he thought someone was at home, he would flee. In his neighborhood, Deonte was liked and considered a Robin Hood figure. He generously shared his loot, paying for others' electricity bills and rent. He could spend $1,000 on diapers and food for single mothers. Perhaps this is why no one believed or wanted to believe he was capable of the accusations against him. On July 15, 2016, almost 2 years after Jill's murder, an unexpected turn of events occurred during what started as a routine court hearing. The prisoner accused of first-degree murder, restrained in handcuffs and shackles, managed to escape from the crowded courtroom. This prisoner was none other than Deonte Resales. How did he pull off such an escape? When investigators listened to the recordings of the prisoner's phone calls, they realized the plan was orchestrated by teenagers. Everything was set up that morning. The key was to obtain the handcuff key. Deonte had weakened the prison jumpsuit to make it easier to run, and he wore regular clothes underneath. When he was led into the courtroom in handcuffs and shackles, another inmate shielded him while removing the chain from his waist, allowing Deonte's hands some movement. He entered the courtroom, surrounded by other prisoners awaiting their hearings. Undoing the handcuffs, he waited for his accomplices to be ready. His twin cousins, acting as Deonte's eyes and ears, were also present in the courtroom. As soon as a car approached, one cousin signaled to the other, who then signaled to Deonte. When new prisoners were brought into the courtroom, Deonte simply stood up and ran. Once outside, he discarded the prison jumpsuit and, knowing the route, which his accomplices had undoubtedly described to him, he sprinted out of the building to a waiting car. Days passed, 2, 3, 4. The fugitive eluded officers, and the reward for his capture grew to $50,000. His family and friends refused to assist the police. On the contrary, they did not believe in his guilt and did what they could to protect him. People couldn't comprehend how a robber, who avoided confrontation with homeowners, had evolved into a killer, assaulting a woman with more than 20 knife wounds. Yet, someone decided to turn in Deonte, revealing he was hiding in a motel. 6 days after the escape, Deonte Resales was captured. He offered no resistance during the arrest. In the subsequent months, all 8 friends who aided Deonte's escape were apprehended and charged. This demonstrated Deonte's intelligence and extraordinary charisma, convincing these individuals to risk their freedom for him. After his arrest, Deonte wrote a letter to the judge from whose trial he escaped, apologizing for the escape. He explained that he had to free himself to find evidence of his innocence. However, when he was apprehended, he was merely sitting in a hotel, interacting with friends, and visiting adult websites. The trial began in 2021, and as with everything in this story, it concluded with an incredible twist. The prosecution was convinced of the case because Deonte could not explain the presence of his DNA on the three crucial elements of the crime: the belt used to tie the victim, one of Justin's knives, and the back door. The version of events seemed to suggest itself. Deonte broke into the house with the intention of robbery. Suddenly, he encountered the homeowner and a struggle ensued. At some point, the woman tried to escape onto the street through the front door, according to a neighbor of the Sue family. It was noon when she heard a scream from the neighbor's house. She managed to notice an object at the front door that sharply moved inside the house. She thought it was a dog. However, investigators and the prosecutor believed it was Jill screaming when Deonte dragged her back into the house. After that, he must have struck her with Justin's knife, as the sharp protrusion on the murder weapon exactly matched the head injury on Jill. When the woman lost consciousness, the perpetrator took her to the bathtub, tied her up, and inflicted knife wounds. Despite detectives initially thinking the criminal wanted to create the appearance of a robbery, the evidence actually matched an interrupted burglary. Additionally, Deonte's escape from the courtroom and his attempts to persuade friends to provide him with an alibi worked against him.
Deonte bribed a prison guard to get a phone, thinking he had succeeded. However, all his calls were, of course, monitored by the police. The defendant asked his friend to lie for him, saying he was in Georgia, not Florida, on the day of the murder. Even though Deonte's phone records proved he was in Florida, he tried to find an explanation for the main prosecution evidence and asked his friend to lie about the DNA. He suggested his friend pretend someone attacked Deonte, cut him, and took his blood to leave at the crime scene. The guy reasoned that accusing a person who was no longer alive would prevent further questioning. However, he didn't know that forensic experts hadn't found his blood at the crime scene and obtained DNA from his other biological materials. It seemed like the evidence was indisputable, but the jury deliberated for 5 days and found Deonte Resales guilty of involuntary manslaughter, not first-degree murder as he was charged. It was a blow to Jill's family, but that was the jury's decision. Or was it? The judge began asking each member of the jury one by one if they agreed with the verdict. It was a standard procedure in court. Therefore, the unexpected answer from the jury foreperson was surprising. She said no. Later, she explained her decision. When the jury deliberated, they couldn't ignore the evidence against Deonte, but 3 people were against convicting the pleasant young man of first-degree murder. They argued and argued, eventually compromising on involuntary manslaughter. However, when the jury foreperson saw the reaction of the defense attorneys in the courtroom, clapping Deonte on the back, smiling, giggling, and congratulating each other on the victory, she declared that she disagreed with the verdict. In her opinion, Deonte deserved a more severe punishment. The trial ended in nothing. A few months later, there was a retrial with new jurors, and this time, the defendant was found guilty of first-degree murder. Involuntary manslaughter meant that Deonte would spend a maximum of 15 years in prison. For first-degree murder, he faced the death penalty or life imprisonment. The Sue family asked the prosecutors to waive the death penalty because that's what Jill wouldn't have wanted. Deonte was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This case was unusual from the very beginning to the end. The police claim their task is to be the voice of the victim. However, it seems they didn't think through this statement. After all, Justin's mother would hardly want to accuse her son of her murder. The most horrifying part is that the police actions were used by Deonte's lawyers. For them, Justin was the perfect alternative suspect. Allegedly, they had a fight with his mother, and the son killed her with his knife. Detectives pressured and harassed Justin, hoping to record a confession, but all they captured were vehement false accusations against the young man, which became a problem for the prosecution. But the most astonishing aspect of this case was how successfully Deonte manipulated people. Overall, he coerced at least 16 individuals into illegal actions to help him escape and fabricate alibis, including 3 young women, each of whom considered herself his girlfriend. Many still do not believe in his innocence, assuming that the police found a scapegoat, and Deonte would never exhibit such cruelty. Currently, the young man is in prison, hoping that his release will be attributed not to appeals or exemplary behavior, but to Kim Kardashian, who is known for her advocacy for prisoners' rights. This is an excellent indicator that Deonte might never regain his freedom.
At 9 a.m. on Monday, October 31st, 2002, the owner of the trading company, Steve Canavan,
opened the door of the warehouse located in the small town of Huyton, near Liverpool, United Kingdom, intending to start the work week. However, upon entering the warehouse, he immediately noticed bloody shoe prints. Following the tracks into a utility room, he discovered the body of a man on the floor.
Steve realized there was nothing he could do to help. Blood was everywhere, and the deceased's face was disfigured beyond recognition. Officers called by Steve noticed a large gunshot hole in the warehouse ceiling. Comparing this with the appearance of the deceased and the mark on the back of his head, they concluded that he had been shot in the face with a shotgun. The head injury was so severe that identification was impossible. However, documents in the victim's pockets revealed the name Gerald or Jed Gilbert. Company owner Steve Canavan explained that 46-year-old Jed worked for him as a sales manager. He was his best employee, a talented salesman who would be irreplaceable. Jed's abilities allowed him to earn well and buy a wonderful Victorian-style house. Success, however, did not go to his head. He was a very pleasant, kind, and of course, sociable person, which was natural for such a job. Steve had no idea why someone would shoot Jed. However, there was a safe on the premises, embedded in the floor. The mat covering the safe was shifted, but it did not seem like someone was looking for keys or attempting to break in. Did Jed come to work during a robbery? An inventory of all items in the warehouse was needed to ensure nothing was missing. However, a more careful examination of the crime scene suggested another scenario. There were no signs of a break-in or forced entry into the warehouse. And when the forensic expert moved the body, 2 bloodied latex fragments were found underneath, likely from a glove. It seemed the killer was trying to create the appearance of a robbery to hide the fact that he came here with the sole purpose of killing Jed Gilbert. Jed arrived at work where the perpetrator lay in wait. When the man opened the door, the killer entered behind him. But why would someone want to kill an ordinary sales manager? Detectives decided to ask this question to his ex-wife, who had just arrived at the crime scene. Jed Gilbert and Ann Huxley met at a nightclub when he was 41 and she was 32. At first glance, they had nothing in common. Anne was born and raised in Kensington, not a very prestigious area of Liverpool where working-class people reside. She had been divorced twice and was raising a daughter and a son. Jed, on the other hand, lived a lavish lifestyle and had never been tied down by marriage. However, they shared an entrepreneurial spirit, both willing to work hard to secure a better life for themselves. Anne managed a network of small businesses, including coffee shops popular among the police, who enjoyed stopping by for a cup of coffee. Anne and Jed immediately liked each other and started dating. The man's family, his sister and mother, didn't approve of the girl, but the lovers paid no attention to it. A year later, Anne moved in with Jed, and in 1998 they got married. Unfortunately, in 2002, after just 4 years of marriage, they divorced. But they continued to live in the same house, under the same roof, just in different rooms. Apparently, their feelings had not cooled, and after some time, the former spouses reconciled and even wanted to remarry. But the day before, on Sunday, the man urgently left for work because he needed to resolve an issue with urgent delivery or something similar and did not return home. After Anne called all relatives, friends, and neighbors all night, she came to his workplace in the morning. Anne went into hysterics upon hearing that Jed had been killed. When she calmed down a bit, the detectives asked if she knew the reason someone might want to harm Jed. They were sure she would say no, but to their surprise, Anne answered yes. Jed was into gambling, a regular at the casino, but unfortunately, he was not a very lucky player. He had accumulated debts, and Anne feared that it would end with them losing their home. That's why, she claimed, she divorced him so that he couldn't dispose of it on his own. However, her husband still found a way to get the money. He embezzled £11,000 from the company he worked for. This meant that the police needed to have a more serious conversation with his boss, Steve Canavan. But that wasn't all. Anne revealed that after the divorce, she was seeing a man named Paul Gunning. Her new boyfriend didn't like that she and her ex-husband were still living under the same roof. Eventually, Anne got fed up, broke up with the man, but he wouldn't let go. In the end, she had to take extreme measures. She asked a friend to intimidate Paul Gunning to make him leave her alone. Thanks to Anne, the investigation gained a whole new set of leads. Perhaps Jed owed a significant amount of money to dangerous people. Or was there a conflict with the employer due to embezzlement from the company? Finally, could it be a jealous lover deciding to eliminate a rival?
While the police were exploring the most likely scenarios, the autopsy report arrived. The forensic expert determined the cause of Jed Gilbert's death, and it turned out to be completely different from what the detectives had expected. Although someone had clearly fired into the ceiling, there were no signs that the man had been shot. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, and the brutality and force of the beating were simply unimaginable. Every bone in the victim's skull was broken, and there was a hole above the left eyebrow. The blows were clearly not inflicted with the butt of a shotgun, and when the police completed an inventory of what was in the warehouse, they found that only a fire extinguisher was missing. So the killer beat the man with a fire extinguisher and took him away from the crime scene. But who could display such cruelty? Jed's ex-wife believed that due to his gambling addiction, he had earned many dangerous enemies. The police investigated the casinos he frequented but couldn't find any significant leads. They failed to establish a connection with casino owners or debt collectors. Moreover, wouldn't Jed be more valuable alive if they wanted him to repay his debts? On the other hand, there was the man's boss, Steve Canavan, from whom Jed had stolen £11,000. However, the police faced another setback here. Steve denied that he would kill an employee over £11,000, especially an employee who brought him much larger profits. Steve even admitted that Jed was irreplaceable. Therefore, he simply demanded the stolen amount back and deducted the money from his salary. At the time of the murder, Jed had returned £5,000. Finally, Steve had a confirmed alibi, and detectives had to acknowledge that nothing pointed to the man's involvement. There was one more potential suspect mentioned by Ann Huxley, her ex-boyfriend, Paul Gunning. Ann thought it was possible that Paul Gunning might have wanted to get rid of Jed to take his place. However, during the conversation with the detectives, Paul vehemently denied any involvement in the case. He spoke openly and directly to the police. Yes, he had a romance with Ann, but it remained in the past, and he had no grievances against her ex-husband. He also had a solid alibi for the time of Jed Gilbert's death. While detectives couldn't find anything linking Paul Gunning to Jed's murder, the man provided them with a very unexpected piece of information. He used to own an escort agency, and a few years ago, Ann Huxley came to work for him. Apparently, she was not devoid of entrepreneurial spirit, as she quickly not only bought the agency from him, but also opened 4 more. The network of stores and coffee shops, including the one frequented by police officers, was just a successful cover for Ann's expanding business, and it was far from the business she claimed to be involved in when talking to the police. It's not entirely clear what prompted the detectives to also speak with Ann's friend, whom she asked to intimidate Paul Gunning. However, after talking to him, they encountered a big surprise. The man, also named Paul Eaton, worked as a bouncer in a nightclub in Birkenhead near Liverpool, where Ann was looking for a place for her next escort agency. They met and became friends there. But according to the 40-year-old man, they were not just friends. Ann was his fiancée. The man admitted that he was in love with Ann, and during a trip to South Africa, he proposed to her, and they got engaged. In other words, it might not have been Paul Gunning, but Paul Eaton who could be jealous of Ann's ex-husband, with whom she lived under the same roof. However, the man replied that he had no reason to be jealous because Ann accepted his proposal, as if that explained everything. Detectives asked him about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, and that's when Paul Eaton started talking nonsense. He claimed that his mother fell ill. He became upset, and seeking support, he called a friend, another Paul Lewis. They got into a car to go to Wales, but on the way, the car started making strange noises, and they had to turn back. They went to a bar, had some drinks, and when they left the bar, the car wouldn't start at all. Investigators verified the alibi with his friend, 36-year-old Paul Lewis, also a bouncer at the bar, who confirmed his friend's words. Although there was nothing particularly fantastic in this version of events, investigators did not believe it. And what also bothered them was that if Ann could easily lie to the police about her fiancé, what else was she willing to lie about? In other words, she immediately classified her ex-boyfriend as a potential suspect, but strangely forgot to mention the man she was planning to marry. Furthermore, according to Ann, she and her husband had reconciled and were planning to remarry, and she referred to Paul Eaton as a friend who had done her a favor. So what was really going on? After examining every detail of Ann's testimony, investigators confirmed that on that fateful day, she spent time with her family,
making several calls to Jed's relatives and friends, expressing concern for him. She even called her fiancé, precisely at the time when, according to his account, they were heading to Wales with a friend. However, the ping from his phone showed that he was actually in the vicinity of the crime scene. Suspicions about Paul Eaton's involvement grew, but what role did his fiancé play in all of this? According to Anne, in early 2002, her husband's gaming addiction forced her to divorce him to avoid losing their house, but they tried to mend their relationship. However, when investigators spoke to the man's relatives, they painted a completely different picture. The man's addiction didn't scare Anne. It infuriated her, so there was no talk of reconciliation. She filed for divorce because she was disgusted by her husband and she had had enough of him. Anne didn't leave the house because he paid for the roof over her head, but treated him like a doormat. After the divorce, they slept in separate rooms, and Anne occasionally brought other men home. This seemingly tormenting situation for Jed lasted for months until everything suddenly changed. One of Jed's friends told the police that in the summer of 2002, he had dinner with the former spouses and couldn't believe the positive changes in their relationship. They appeared to be a happy couple again. Anne affectionately embraced Jed and assured everyone that they were planning to remarry. Completely perplexed, investigators couldn't understand why Paul Eaton believed they were engaged when Anne was planning to marry her ex-husband again. Everything fell into place after examining the finances of the former spouses. One August day, Anne walked into an insurance office and took out a £400,000 life insurance policy on both of them. In the event of the sudden death of one of the ex-spouses, the surviving one would receive £400,000. She then went to a lawyer with a will in which Jed left everything to her. 6 weeks later, he was killed. Anne Huxley increasingly appeared as a black widow who lured her ex-husband into a deadly trap to collect the insurance payout in the house. Meanwhile, evidence against Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis was accumulating like a snowball. The owner of the nightclub in Birkenhead, where both men worked as bouncers, revealed that on the night Jed was killed, the men came to the club carrying a fire extinguisher. Perhaps they thought no one would pay attention to two bouncers with a fire extinguisher. The adjacent building to the club belonged to a hot-dip galvanizing workshop, which housed acid containers. The police contacted the workshop and requested the containers to be drained. There, they found the fire extinguisher. It was damaged but not destroyed. Immediately after this, the results came in from examining the latex scraps found under Jed's body. They were indeed pieces of a glove with Paul Lewis's DNA. It was minimal, but enough to prove that Paul Lewis was at the crime scene, wearing gloves, and must have been involved in the murder. So, after 2 months of investigation, the police had gathered enough evidence against Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis. However, detectives were convinced that Anne also played a role in her ex-husband's murder. She had already persuaded Paul Eaton to attack her boyfriend. What would stop her from orchestrating another assault, only this time to get rid of her husband and claim his property and insurance? The challenge remained in proving it because all the evidence collected so far was circumstantial. On December 16, 2002, 6 weeks after Jed's murder, Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis were arrested and brought in for questioning. Paul Eaton didn't resist for long and admitted that he was at the warehouse, but claimed he went there supposedly to warn Jed to stay away from his fiancée. However, Jed reacted aggressively, suddenly pulled out a shotgun and pointed it at Paul. With no other option, Paul had to defend himself. The men struggled. A shot was fired and the bullet hit the ceiling. Then, Paul Eaton reached for the fire extinguisher hanging on the wall and struck his opponent with it. After the commotion, his friend rushed in. Paul Lewis confirmed that he was waiting in the car outside when he heard a loud noise and ran inside. There, he saw the victim on the floor, and Paul Eaton beating him with the fire extinguisher. It was not entirely self-defense, since Paul Eaton came to the warehouse on his own, but he presented the situation as if it was a quarrel and claimed no guilt in the murder. However, this story did not explain why Paul Lewis ran to the warehouse in latex gloves and how they ended up torn under the victim's body. Both men also remained silent about Anne. Therefore, when she appeared at the police station the next day, she confidently told the same story as before. She claimed to be mourning her husband, and there was no reason to suspect her of the murder. Supposedly, Paul Eaton was so infatuated with her that he decided to commit murder, and she knew nothing about it. As for the insurance and the will, these documents were arranged in the interests of her children. If anything were to happen to her, they would be financially protected. The police had nothing to counter her argument. Fortunately, as it often happens, the killer cannot keep their crime a secret. A witness, to whom Paul Eaton confessed everything, came forward to the police. In reality, he entered the warehouse with a shotgun, intending to shoot Jed. However, at the last minute, he couldn't bring himself to commit the crime. Paul Eaton was a strong man, a bouncer at the club, but not a criminal, and he lacked the courage to kill someone face to face. Jed seized the weapon, and a struggle ensued. It's unclear how it would have ended, but Paul Lewis came to his friend's aid. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and began beating Jed. At some point, Paul Eaton might have taken control, although detectives believe that Paul Lewis was responsible for all the fatal blows to Jed. Leaving the lifeless man on the floor, the accomplices left. The witness stated that the accomplices did it for money and promised the men £100,000 collectively for committing the crime. The witness's testimony not only provided the police with enough evidence to charge Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis, but also confirmed the police's suspicions that the mastermind behind it all was the Black Widow, Anne Haxley. As if that wasn't enough, another witness came forward, providing testimony against the accomplices. On that fateful evening, he agreed to give his friends a ride to the warehouse, thinking they needed to repossess a car due to unpaid debts. There was a van near the warehouse, and the witness assumed that the men would take it. This didn't surprise him at all, as they had previously performed similar tasks for insurance companies. According to his account, Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis asked him to park nearby and simply wait for a call. Interestingly, he parked right next to a mobile phone tower. After 20 minutes, they called and asked to pick them up. Only when they got into the car did the man realize that he had allowed himself to get involved in something unpleasant. The men were discussing an attack on someone, and he noticed blood on one of their shoes. There was enough evidence and witness testimony to charge both men with the murder of Jed and Anne with conspiracy to commit murder. The only thing the police didn't find was the shotgun the men disposed of. The trials began in April 2004. Since Paul Eaton was accused of delivering the fatal blows, he appeared before the judge first. Surprisingly, he shocked everyone by confessing to the murder. In England and Wales, this automatically leads to a life sentence. His decision sparked many debates and speculations. Some believed he got in too deep and would have been convicted anyway. Others thought he couldn't bear Anne's suffering and was trying to protect her. Unfortunately, she didn't reciprocate when it was her turn to testify. She happily confirmed that Paul Eaton took matters into his own hands out of jealousy because she and Jed had reconciled. Anne tried to portray herself as a modest housewife, but her efforts were unsuccessful. The prosecution effectively portrayed Anne as a Black Widow. Angry over her husband's gambling debts, she divorced him only to devise a deadly plan to enrich herself at his expense. She was willing to stop at nothing to get the house and £400,000. When Paul Lewis gave his testimony, he also tried to shift the blame onto Paul Eaton, despite the evidence suggesting otherwise. In the end, all three were found guilty. The men were sentenced to life imprisonment, and Anne received a 20-year prison term. The men were given the opportunity to apply for parole in 2020, but their release was denied. From the very beginning, the murder of Jed Gilbert, a 46-year-old sales manager, resembled the script of a Hollywood movie more than an ordinary criminal case. Relentlessly following the trail of evidence, detectives ventured into the realm of gambling, love triangles, escort agencies, and finally apprehended murderers driven by the desire for quick gain. Passion, greed, jealousy, betrayal, the list could go on indefinitely. This case had it all. When the body of a teenage girl was found murdered, the tiny town of Wausau in Wisconsin was gripped by fear. Everyone worried they might be the next victim of the ruthless intruder. But if the motive was money, why didn't he take it? The stories of the suspects only puzzled the detectives further. They wondered, was this merely a show to conceal what was really happening behind closed doors? Or was it genuine grief over the loss of a loved one? Until they found a startling clue that could put the final nail in the killer's coffin. Saturday, May 2nd, 2009, began like any other day for the emergency services in the quiet town of Wausau, Wisconsin. Although it was expected to be an uneventful day, a call came in at 1:30 p.m. A woman reported that her neighbor had asked her to call an ambulance for his brother's girlfriend. She was lying on the floor of their apartment with a throat wound and cuts all over her body. The police officers dispatched to the scene hoped the woman was mistaken, as the situation often turns out to be less severe than the caller describes. But not this time. Several people were waiting for the officers in the parking lot of the apartment complex. One of them stepped forward and led them to the apartment. It was 19-year-old Hugo Ramirez. The young man could barely form sentences due to how much he was crying and shaking. Hugo was about to show the detectives what had shocked him so much. The officers would not soon forget this scene either. Entering the apartment, they walked through an unremarkable living room and kitchen and approached a small hallway. Hugo pointed to the bedroom at the very end on the left. Even before stepping into the room, the officers were stunned by the sight that met their eyes. The drying blood was everywhere, on the carpet, on the belongings, and of course, on the girl lying in the center of this bloody scene. Hugo informed them that the girl's name was Brianna Schneller. Brianna lay on her back, her mutilated face covered with a towel. There were deep wounds on her neck and across the upper part of her torso. Cuts on her arms indicated that she had fought for her life, but the killer had overpowered her. Now the police needed to hurry. Journalists were already surrounding the crime scene, and it was crucial that Brianna's loved ones did not learn of her death from the news. By the time the officers contacted the Schneller family, they already knew something had happened at the apartment where the girl lived and that someone had died. But they didn't know that Brianna was the victim. Her parents had been trying to reach her without success. They were informed of the news at the station. Afterward, they were asked to identify Brianna from photographs taken at the crime scene. Even after confirming it was her, her parents, Craig and Lori, and her brother Rocky, still couldn't believe what had happened. Despite their unspeakable sorrow, the family members tried to provide the police with as much information as possible about Brianna and the details of her life leading up to the murder. Craig and Lori explained that Brianna's life was much like that of her peers. She was finishing school, working part-time as a waitress in a restaurant, and enjoyed spending her free time with friends. She loved shopping, dancing, and music. Moreover, Brianna was looking forward to a trip to Tennessee that summer, where she was to present an important project for a renowned non-profit national organization of professional and technical student leaders. Brianna was the only person in the entire state of Wisconsin who met all the criteria to participate in this event. To the family, what had happened made no sense. As Craig explained, she didn't have a single enemy. Her relationship with her boyfriend, 22-year-old Sebastian Ramirez, Hugo's brother, was wonderful. The couple had met a couple of years ago and had been inseparable since. During this time, the parents had gotten to know the young man well. Naturally, they had concerns when Brianna decided to move in with him at 18. They worried that she was growing up too fast. But Sebastian truly loved their daughter, so they accepted her decision. After high school, she planned to pursue higher education in restaurant management and dreamed of opening a restaurant with Sebastian. She genuinely enjoyed working in the restaurant business, and she was loved by her colleagues and customers. The girl's parents also helped the police narrow down the time frame of the attack on Brianna. Her mother, Lori, was the last person to speak with Brianna a few hours before the body was discovered. That day, Lori had taken her daughter's car to the auto shop to fix the brakes and had texted her daughter at 10 a.m. Thus, the attack occurred sometime after Lori spoke with her daughter at 10 a.m. and before Hugo found her at 1:30 p.m. While the detectives were speaking with the girl's parents, forensic experts found several clues at the crime scene. First of all, an iron lying on the floor near Brianna caught their attention. Various parts of it were scattered on the floor, and there was blood on the iron, suggesting the killer might have used it as a weapon. In the bathroom sink were 2 knives, one of which was missing its sharp tip. Blood was found on a bar of soap nearby, indicating that the killer had taken the time to wash the knives and their hands, but had missed leaving a bloody shoe print on the mat. Further examination of the apartment revealed 2 more interesting points. First, there were no signs of forced entry, and second, nothing seemed to be missing. This was especially curious because cash was scattered throughout the apartment. Various bills ranging from $1 to $20 added up to a considerable sum. If a robber had broken in for money, they would have taken it. Thus, the evidence at the crime scene indicated that Brianna herself was the target of the attack. The autopsy confirmed this conclusion. The most crucial information the medical examiner shared with the detectives was that the girl had fought for her life, and the killer's DNA likely remained under her nails. Skin samples found under her nails were sent for analysis. Overall, the autopsy confirmed what the investigators already suspected. The attack was unprecedented in its brutality and the attacker's fury. Brianna had been struck on the head with a blunt object, likely the iron found near her body. The attacker also slashed her throat with a knife and inflicted so many stab wounds that the pathologist couldn't accurately count them. The knife wounds were particularly severe, and at least 2 of them were fatal enough to kill her within a minute. The tip of one of the knives found in the sink was discovered in one of her wounds. Usually, such a savage attack indicates that the killer must have felt uncontrollable rage towards the victim to inflict so many injuries. But who could have harbored such strong feelings toward Brianna? The police knew of at least one person they needed to speak with immediately. Sebastian was brought to the station along with his brother, but they were placed in separate interrogation rooms so their statements could be compared later. Sebastian explained that he woke up around 9:15 a.m., an hour before he was due at the Mexican restaurant where he and his brother worked. The restaurant, El Tequila Salsa, was about 3 kilometers from the apartment, a 10-minute drive. The young man took a shower and chatted with Brianna, as she didn't need to go to school on Saturdays. Hugo had overslept, so his brother had to wake him up just before leaving the house at 10 a.m. By 10:15 a.m., Sebastian was already at work and was there when he received the call informing him about what had happened to his girlfriend. Hugo's story began much like his brother's version. After being woken up by his brother, he quickly got ready and left the house 15 minutes after Sebastian. Nothing unusual happened at work. At 1:20 p.m., Hugo went on a break and drove home to take a short nap. Entering the apartment, he initially didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. He walked down the hallway and into his room, but he soon felt uncomfortable as if something was wrong. That's when he noticed that Sebastian's room door was open. Hugo peeked inside and to his horror saw Brianna lying on the floor. Rushing over, Hugo started shouting her name, begging her to get up, to wake up, but she didn't respond. Only then did he notice how much blood there was in the room. He tried to dial 911, but his mind suddenly stopped working and his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't even press the buttons. He then ran downstairs, where through his panic he tried to explain to a neighbor that they needed to call for help. The young men seemed genuinely devastated by what had happened. Investigators wanted to believe them, but they knew they needed evidence to confirm their innocence. It was possible they were simply excellent actors, or were hiding remorse beneath a mask of grief and pain. Since both brothers' stories were identical, detectives considered the possibility that one of them committed the crime and the other was covering for him. In such a scenario, Sebastian seemed to have a potential motive to kill Brianna. Officers questioned the brothers about their relationship with Brianna, whether there were any issues, quarrels, or jealousy. Sebastian categorically denied any problems and stuck to his story. Brianna was the love of his life, and they were looking forward to a happy future together. Hugo was questioned with even greater scrutiny, especially after it was revealed he was supposed to work until 3 p.m. that day, but had changed his break time with a colleague due to a hangover, wanting to go home and rest. Detectives wanted to know if anything had happened between him and Brianna. Were there arguments? Perhaps Hugo also had romantic feelings for her, but Sebastian proved to be a more successful rival. However, Hugo vehemently denied this. Brianna was like a sister to him. He knew how deeply she and Sebastian loved each other, and he would never stand in their way. These interrogations continued for hours, but no matter what the police asked, Hugo and Sebastian stood by their stories. However, the brothers were able to clarify the issue of the scattered money found throughout the apartment. It was Hugo's tips. Previously, he used to carefully count all the money, but lately he had become lazy. When he came home, he simply emptied his pockets wherever, always promising himself to deal with it later. After obtaining DNA samples from the brothers, they were released, but in the eyes of the detectives, they remained the only suspects in Brianna's murder. Therefore, their next task was to either confirm or disprove the brothers' testimonies. Colleagues from the Mexican restaurant El Tequila Salsa confirmed that the young men were at work. Moreover, the restaurant had surveillance cameras, including ones that recorded the kitchen area. After reviewing the footage, the police confirmed that Sebastian arrived at work first at 10:13 a.m. and did not leave until after Brianna's body was discovered. Hugo arrived at work a few minutes later and took his break at 1:20 p.m., just as he had stated. At the same time, the detectives were following another lead. Their conclusion that nothing had been stolen from the apartment had been hasty. Although the money and valuables were indeed left behind, the police had not found Brianna's phone. Like any teenage girl, Brianna always kept her phone with her. Moreover, she had exchanged messages with her mother at 10 a.m., so she definitely had it with her before the murder. This greatly interested the police, as the phone could contain something crucial to solving her murder. Therefore, the detectives made finding the phone their priority. They contacted Brianna's service provider. The phone company pinged the device and not only found that it was on, but also pinpointed its exact location. The detectives took one look at the address and were stunned. They knew this place. More than that, they had just been there. The phone was located near the El Tequila Salsa restaurant where the brothers Sebastian and Hugo worked. The detectives rushed to the location to find and seize the device as quickly as possible. Upon arrival, they realized that the coordinates were not for the restaurant itself, but for the parking lot of the shopping center where the restaurant was located. The police soon narrowed down the search area to the section where the dumpsters were. The detectives were reluctant to sift through all the garbage bags and had a simple yet brilliant idea. They called the phone, opening the dumpsters one by one. Finally, they heard the ringtone. Carefully moving the contents of the dumpster, the officers saw a light-colored bag through which the phone's screen light was visible. The bag contained several items, not just the phone. The police were eager to open it, but had to send it to the lab first because it could have DNA on it, especially on the top where someone had carefully twisted it closed. However, the detectives could already make one conclusion. This was not an ordinary bag, but a bag with the logo of the El Tequila Salsa restaurant, which customers used for takeout orders. The circle around the brothers was tightening more and more. Of course, they seemed to have an alibi, but the investigators couldn't believe that anyone else had committed the murder. Moreover, the pathologist couldn't determine the exact time of the girl's death to the minute. What if the crime happened a little earlier than they assumed? The girl had communicated with her mother at 10 a.m. Immediately after that, one of the brothers, or even both, killed Brianna, quickly got ready, and showed up at work at 10:15 a.m. Then they threw the bag with the evidence into the trash bin near the restaurant, hoping no one would find it. After the forensic experts collected DNA samples from the bag, it could finally be opened. Inside, in addition to Brianna's phone, there were warm gloves, but from different pairs, with one of them stained with blood, and also women's underwear, 2 pairs of panties. The investigators had expected anything, but not this. They had more questions than answers. According to Sebastian, the underwear belonged to Brianna. One of the gloves likely had been taken from the apartment as well. However, these items contradicted all the theories the detectives had been considering. If Hugo or Sebastian had committed the crime, it would be absurd for them to take the girl's underwear. But Sebastian and Hugo did not kill the girl. After examining Brianna's phone, investigators saw that her last conversation was not with her mother, but with a friend. Brianna sent her last message at 10:23, when the brothers had already definitely arrived at the restaurant, as confirmed by surveillance cameras. The entire investigation turned upside down. The police had never considered any other suspects besides the Ramirez brothers, but it turned out that both were completely innocent. So, who was the killer? And why did they dispose of the bag with evidence right near the El Tequila Salsa restaurant? Now, the detectives had to add a multitude of names to their list of suspects, employees and patrons of the El Tequila Salsa restaurant. They considered it highly unlikely that someone unrelated to the restaurant killed Brianna, collected incriminating evidence, and disposed of it right near the restaurant. Therefore, they first reviewed the list of employees, and one name caught their attention: Luciano Sanchez Ramos. The young man worked as a dishwasher at the restaurant and lived in the same building as Brianna. But most importantly, he was home on the morning of the murder. He arrived at work half an hour after Brianna sent her last message to her friend. When the police brought him in for questioning, he did not show much willingness to talk. Perhaps this was due to his immigration status or just a general distrust of the police. Nevertheless, he agreed to provide a DNA sample. The detective asked if anyone could verify his alibi, even partially. Luciano said there was someone, his colleague, the restaurant's cook Raul, who gave him a ride to work. The police spoke with Raul, who confirmed that he picked up Luciano. Raul honked his horn, and within a couple of minutes, Luciano came out of the house, behaving as usual. The investigators wanted some reliable confirmation of this and hoped that surveillance cameras might reveal what Luciano did that morning. Did he really just go to work at 11 a.m., or did he stop by the dumpster to dispose of the evidence? Unfortunately, all the restaurant's cameras filmed only inside the establishment. However, there was a gas station across from the dumpsters that had its own surveillance cameras. The quality of the footage left much to be desired, and the dumpsters were far from the gas station. Still, these videos provided invaluable help to the investigation. On May 9th, the police finally finished reviewing all the footage from the restaurant and the parking lot where the dumpsters were located. Individually, these videos were not very useful, but when the detectives correlated the timestamps, they obtained a much clearer picture of what had happened. At 1:16 p.m., one person exited through the restaurant's back door. Simultaneously, only one person approached the dumpster. It was 22-year-old restaurant cook Raul Ponce Rocha. He threw away the trash, quickly returned to the restaurant kitchen, and washed his hands. What was even more interesting was that Raul was the only one who left the restaurant during the time frame when Brianna's murder was committed. At 10:21 a.m., just a few minutes after the Ramirez brothers arrived at work, he exited through the back door to go pick up Luciano and returned at 10:56 a.m. Notably, he left wearing a brown hoodie but returned without it. He confirmed that he and Luciano did not make any stops on their way back to work. The detectives asked him why he was gone for 35 minutes when the trip to pick up Luciano should have taken a maximum of 20 minutes. Where did the extra 15 minutes go? Raul was surprisingly stubborn and did not attempt to explain. The detective then asked about the cuts on his hands. Raul explained that as a cook, he frequently handled knives and had cut himself about 3 weeks ago, although the cuts looked fresh. While the investigators were confident that they had the right suspect, one question continued to trouble them. Why did Raul attack Brianna, and with such brutality? After all, he barely knew her. The Ramirez brothers had always treated him well, considering him a jovial fellow who often told funny stories and never had any quarrels with them. But detectives soon found the answer to this question. The police had enough evidence to obtain a DNA sample from Raul and a search warrant for the house where he lived with his parents and brothers. To prevent him from fleeing, they detained him based on his illegal immigration status. During the search of his bedroom, police found a glove that matched the one found in the dumpster, a sweatshirt with strands of hair that could belong to Brianna, and, finally, under the mattress, several adult videos and 4 pairs of women's panties. Everything fell into place when officers remembered Brianna's mother Lori's words about how she had taken her daughter's car to the auto repair shop that day. On the morning of May 2, 2009, Raul arrived at the restaurant around 9 a.m. On his way, he passed by the house where the girl lived and noticed that her car was not in its usual spot. He made a fatal mistake, assuming she wasn't home. Knowing that Hugo and Sebastian would soon arrive for work, he decided it was a perfect opportunity to add to his modest collection and steal something from Brianna's belongings. Just minutes after the Ramirez brothers arrived for work, Raul left, got into his car, and under the pretext of picking up Luciano, headed to the girl's house. He didn't immediately signal Luciano and instead went into the apartment where the brothers and Brianna lived. The lock on the apartment door was not very secure and could easily be opened with a plastic card. He entered the apartment. If the girl had caught him in the act, Raul could have claimed he was looking for the brothers and that the door was open. But most likely, the girl caught him stealing her underwear. Realizing she could identify him, Raul panicked, first hitting her with an iron and then slashing her throat with a knife, inflicting several other wounds. Detectives speculate that he began to derive pleasure from the process. Otherwise, it's unclear why he would strike her multiple times with 2 knives. After the murder, he quickly tried to clean up and took the evidence with him, as he still needed to pick up Luciano. He then returned to work as if nothing had happened and disposed of the evidence packet. All doubts about Raul's involvement disappeared when the lab results arrived. His DNA was found on the knife, the packet, the gloves, the iron, and under Brianna's fingernails. The hair on his sweatshirt also belonged to the victim. Furthermore, a blood-stained shoe print in the bathroom matched the size and pattern of Raul's shoes that he wore on the day of the murder. Raul was charged with Brianna's murder. The trial began in 2011. Initially, during interrogations, Raul claimed he had never spoken to Brianna and never entered the house where she lived. However, by the start of the trial, his story changed. Despite almost pinning the murder on Sebastian and Hugo, Raul showed no remorse and decided to accuse an innocent third person of the crime. He claimed that he had entered the apartment but left, leaving behind his colleague Sergio Juarez Gutierrez, who Brianna was discussing something with in another room. This statement could have planted doubts in the minds of the jurors because Sergio hastily left for Mexico, and Raul's lawyers were confident they wouldn't be able to question him. However, the police managed to contact Sergio in Mexico, and he was not pleased to hear that his name had been dragged through the mud. He returned for the trial and proved that he was nowhere near Brianna on the day of the murder. Sergio had returned to Mexico shortly before the murder to take care of his father, who had cancer. No one expected Sergio to appear in court, and it was a serious blow to the defendant's defense. It took the jurors only 90 minutes to find Raul guilty of first-degree murder, robbery, and theft. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Thus, a young woman lost her life due to a tragic mistake. Raul did not enter the apartment with the intention of killing her. But why did he choose murder instead of being charged with unlawful entry? Was he afraid of being deported? That everyone would find out about his collection? Or did he simply not realize the consequences of his actions? Did he cover Brianna's face with a towel, unable to face what he had done? Brianna's father admitted that he wanted to talk to Raul, perhaps to ask him all these questions. However, Raul declined his offer to meet. He never took responsibility for the crime. His decision was based solely on the assumption that Brianna wasn't home. After the trial, Lori Schneller said that the verdict wouldn't bring back her daughter, but would allow them to live on. "We are glad that justice was served for her," she said. "I don't know if there will ever be a day like before, but it has become a little easier after the verdict." On April 18, 2011, Jessica Bullock couldn't sit still all day. It had been a whole day since she had been able to reach her mother, 46-year-old Rebecca or Becky Porter, whereas they usually talked every day. Jessica was particularly concerned because her mother had been complaining of feeling unwell, possibly food poisoning or something similar. Jessica urged her mother to go to the hospital, but Becky, who disliked missing work, kept putting it off. On April 17th, the last time they spoke, Becky promised her daughter she would check on herself in the morning. Yet, evening had come the next day, and there was still no word from her mother. Jessica checked with other family members, but they couldn't reach Becky either. Jessica deserves credit. She could have assumed that with Becky's husband, Russell, or Rusty, as his relatives lived nearby, there was no cause for concern. But no, she decided to check in person. Jessica got into her car and drove 45 minutes to her mother's house. She hadn't been there many times, but she immediately sensed that something was wrong. One of the doors was wide open. Lights were on inside the house, and her mother's car was parked in the driveway. Jessica approached the door and called out for her mother, but all she got in response was chilling silence. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie. The only illuminated house in the middle of a large plot of land, seemingly occupied but unresponsive to calls. Fearing what she might find inside, around midnight, Jessica contacted the Greene County, Missouri Rescue Service. The responding police officers thoroughly searched all the rooms and informed Jessica that there were no intruders inside. However, they couldn't calm her down because there was nobody in the house at all. Instead, they encountered a plethora of details that alarmed even the experienced officers. Disorder reigned in the bedroom. Items were strewn across the floor, including bedding, and the mattress was askew, as if someone had abruptly jumped out of bed. Becky's phone and purse containing credit cards, cash, and documents were left behind. Rusty's medications lay on the bedside table. He took them daily after his cancerous tumor removal, and he would have taken them with him if they had left. However, how could the couple have left the house if their only car, which they shared, was parked at home with the keys in the ignition? In another room, likely a home office, a tangle of cables lay on the floor. But the most alarming discoveries awaited the officers in the kitchen. First and foremost, they were almost overwhelmed by the strong smell of bleach. Puddles of bleach were gleaming on the floor, yet the only bleach bottle under the sink was completely full. The kitchen window was open, and the protective screen on it was torn. Finally, after circling around the house, the officers discovered scattered broken surveillance cameras. It seemed like initially they were positioned to cover maximum area around the house, but someone had walked around the house and destroyed them all. Some cables connected to these cameras ran through the walls of the house, leading to the same home office where the tangle of wires lay. When the officers returned to the room, they realized that the cameras and monitor on the floor were connected to a computer, which was conspicuously absent. This was one of the most telling pieces of evidence, especially considering that Rusty had installed the cameras quite recently. Moreover, it's not common for people to install so many cameras in the middle of a farm. Was Rusty afraid of something? All the findings suggested that the spouses weren't together at the time of their sudden disappearance. The first theory of the detectives was that perhaps Becky and Rusty became victims of a botched nighttime robbery. However, the evidence didn't support this theory. Besides the car and cash, other valuable items like the television remained untouched. Maybe Rusty got into trouble, owed money to someone, and the couple decided to disappear this way. Did one spouse do something to the other, get scared of the crime committed, and flee? Or did someone attack them in the middle of the night? At that moment, investigators were considering numerous scenarios, each worse than the other, and doubted a favorable outcome. The police began questioning friends and relatives of the couple, starting with Rusty's mother, Kay Simmons, who lived in a small house directly behind the family home. She recounted that Rusty and Becky had only been married for about a year. The newlyweds moved into the house on the 49-acre property owned by Kay's parents. Also, less than a kilometer away from the young couple, Kay's brother and Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell, lived with his wife Carolyn. Rusty and Becky seemed like a very happy couple, but their relationship raised doubts among their close circle. Some were uneasy about the 12-year age gap between the spouses, and Jessica and her brother even skipped their mother's wedding. On the evening of the previous day, the 17th, Rusty's son dropped by to ask his mother for painkillers because Becky wasn't feeling well. According to Kay, Rusty behaved as usual and didn't tell his mother anything that would worry her. She also didn't hear any strange sounds later that night. But when she stepped onto the porch the next morning, she saw Becky's car. Kay was surprised because Becky was a very responsible, hard-working woman who never left for work later than 7:30. Despite her son and daughter-in-law living just a few steps away from her house, she tried not to intrude and didn't go to them, simply assuming that Becky stayed home because she was unwell. But now she was certain that something had happened to her son and daughter-in-law before the morning of the 18th. Meanwhile, detectives questioned her about Rusty and Becky's relationship. Did they have any problems? Could anyone have harbored a grudge against them? And Kay immediately thought of one person. Before marrying Rusty, Becky spent 26 years in a marriage with a church pastor. However, they decided to divorce, and according to their friends, they couldn't part amicably. The former spouses fought for a long time over ownership rights of the restaurant they had previously managed together. They had been divorced for only 4 months when Becky met her future husband online. Naturally, this piqued the interest of investigators, and on the 4th day of the investigation, they questioned the ex-husband. However, it quickly became apparent that he had no connection to Becky and Rusty's disappearance. Although their divorce was accompanied by scandals, the man continued to live his life, and he had a solid alibi for the time of the couple's disappearance. Moreover, he seemed genuinely upset about what could have happened to them. After ruling out Becky's ex-husband, the police continued to delve into the personal lives of the newlyweds. Once again, the investigators quickly uncovered something interesting. Becky had complained that she couldn't stand it anymore and things couldn't continue like this. When the police questioned her daughter Jessica about this, she said that her mother had confided in her that she and her husband had been arguing frequently lately. Of course, various negative scenarios immediately sprang to the detectives' minds, suggesting that Rusty might have done something to Becky and then fled. However, unlike Becky's family, all of Rusty's relatives and friends unanimously insisted that he sincerely loved his wife, and they had never seen him happier. He truly loved her and had changed for the better because of her. So why did the woman complain to her daughter about problems? It turned out that Becky had grievances, not against her husband, but against his family, specifically against one person. Becky's grievances were directed towards Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell. Robert lived nearby Rusty and Becky on the same 49-acre property. Kay and her brother Robert had always been very close, but he didn't like the fact that his nephew had settled on the property, which he likely considered entirely his own. He was very possessive about anything that belonged to his parents, down to the smallest details. The rift between uncle and nephew had escalated to the point where both had tried to obtain restraining orders against each other multiple times. The last time Rusty filed a complaint against his uncle was 1 or 2 weeks before the disappearance. In his statement, Rusty described how Robert, passing by the couple's house, shouted that Rusty should be careful because he wouldn't stay there for long. When investigators spoke to Robert, he didn't deny the obvious and admitted that his relationship with his nephew was strained, but he claimed that the threats were just words without meaning. Moreover, he had more reason to fear Rusty, as he was just an old man with health problems, and of course, he would never harm his nephew or his wife. Additionally, Robert had a very solid alibi. He worked as a long-haul truck driver, and during the couple's disappearance, he was headed to Texas with his wife. This was confirmed by phone records for both Robert and his wife, Carolyn. With Becky's ex-husband and Rusty's uncle ruled out as suspects, investigators hit a dead end. However, another crime shook them out of it. On April 25th, a week after the couple's disappearance, police were called to the scene of a double homicide of another married couple. The second crime eerily resembled the disappearance of the Porter couple, and it also began with a call to 911. Early in the morning around 5 o'clock, a neighbor of the couple called emergency services and said he had scared off a stranger wearing a black hoodie. The person ran away down the road. When officers arrived, they found Donald and Helen Willingham murdered. They had been attacked with a knife. The similarities were striking. An unknown assailant had broken into both couples' homes. Almost nothing was stolen, and there were no obvious suspects. Furthermore, Donald was a pastor, and Becky had been married to a pastor for over 20 years. Investigators pondered whether the cases were connected, or if it was just an astonishing coincidence. Was there a serial killer roaming the county, targeting married couples? However, a breakthrough occurred in the Donald and Helen Willingham case 3 months later. A young man named Jose Huckleberry was arrested on charges of robbery. After 7 hours of interrogation, he confessed to the murders. When detectives learned his motive and the details of the attacks, they had to admit that these two cases were not linked. The situation for the investigation was not improving. All the evidence collected up to that point suggested that Rusty and Becky's disappearance was linked to some crime. But what? Now the investigators had neither a motive nor any suspects. The couple's relatives and friends did everything possible to keep the public aware of the case. They printed a huge number of flyers and posted them in all frequented places, gave interviews to local media, and, of course, continued to cling to the only glimmer of hope in the realm of dark thoughts and forebodings. Hope. Despite the grim circumstances, the community remained supportive, rallying around the missing couple's loved ones and assisting in any way they could. The search for Rusty and Becky continued, fueled by determination and the unwavering belief that answers would eventually surface. And suddenly, completely unexpectedly, a new lead emerged. A prisoner serving time in the local jail came forward with information that would interest investigators. Shortly before his arrest, he was relaxing in a bar where he met a man named Tony Friend. They struck up a conversation during which Tony boasted about several crimes he had committed. Among them was the murder of Rusty and Becky Porter. Detectives were skeptical of the informant, who naturally came forward only in hopes of striking a deal with the prosecutor. However, they were obligated to investigate. At the very least, they needed to find out who this Tony Friend was. The more they delved into the man's past, the fewer doubts remained about the informant's words. Tony Friend, 43, had a history of repeated involvement in violent attacks and armed robberies, rather than minor offenses, indicating a propensity for cruelty. However, it was only after examining his phone data that detectives believed they had a solid lead. On the night of April 17th, he was in close proximity to Rusty and Becky Porter's home, and then he headed towards the Cedar Creek area, known for its vast expanse of dense forest, although investigators didn't know exactly where. They invited him in for questioning, but it proved to be a futile exercise. Tony denied any connection to the couple, claiming he hadn't committed any crimes and had no knowledge of the matter. He didn't answer most of the questions, and those he did answer were so evasive that essentially the only thing he confirmed was his name and age. Detectives had hoped for a more fruitful outcome, but they were now convinced that they needed to dig deeper in this direction. Knowing that Tony had been near the missing couple's home before heading towards Cedar Creek, investigators decided to speak with his relatives and friends. Since Tony grew up in the area, he likely knew it well, and there could have been a secluded spot known only to his close acquaintances. They were right. Tony's cousin immediately recalled a place where they used to play as children. It was an area with dense vegetation near Cedar Creek, inaccessible by car. The kids called it the bulldozer spot because that's where old, non-functional cars were dumped. There were also dilapidated and abandoned cabins, which had been falling apart since they were children. The woman led the police to this location, and it turned out to be the piece of information they had been missing. On July 21st, the police headed to the specified location in Cedar Creek, specifically to the old cabin where Tony used to play with his friends in his childhood. Immediately, they detected a distinct smell, the unmistakable odor of decomposition. In the center of the dilapidated cabin, amidst piles of debris, they found a hole in the wooden floor. Inside, they discovered the bodies of 2 individuals, still dressed in their pajamas. Blood at the scene indicated that they were killed right there. The bodies had significantly decomposed, and investigators relied on dental records and DNA to confirm their identities. It was Rusty and Becky. Autopsies revealed that each of them had died from a single gunshot wound to the right temple, fired at close range. The discovery of the bodies dashed the last hopes of Becky and Russell's family to see them alive. It was even more difficult for them because they couldn't comprehend why someone would do such a thing. It was an execution-style murder. However, the investigators' task shifted from searching for bodies to finding the killer, and all circumstantial evidence pointed to one suspect. The police had another ace up their sleeve. Despite Tony's hardened criminal background, modern technology played a crucial role in the investigation. Officers revisited Tony's phone data and discovered that 3 of his close associates, his wife, Wendy Friend, his son, Philip Friend, and his nephew, Dusty Hicks, had followed a similar path to Tony on the night of April 17th, the day the couple went missing. If Tony remained tight-lipped, Perhaps they could pressure one of them. Investigators identified 26-year-old Philip, Tony's son, as the weakest link among the accomplices. During the period between the couple's disappearance and the discovery of the bodies, Philip had been implicated in a theft and was serving time in prison. He had already experienced incarceration, so when detectives threatened him with charges of double homicide, he agreed to talk. On December 17th, the young man revealed that his father had offered him a job to ensure that two individuals would never celebrate another birthday. It was criminal slang for murder, and Philip understood the gravity of the task and agreed to it. So, on April 17th, according to the boy's account, his father, Wendy, Dusty, and he got into the car and headed to Rusty and Becky's house. Wendy stayed in the car while the others put on gloves, balaclavas, taped the cuffs of their sleeves and pants with tape to not leave a single hair at the crime scene, grabbed a bottle of cleaning solution with bleach, and headed towards the family's home. They destroyed the cameras and searched the entire house for a way inside, but they were unsuccessful. They were about to leave when Dusty noticed a partially open kitchen window. They cut through the protective screen, pushed the window open, and Tony helped Dusty crawl inside. Dusty then opened the back door. The accomplices then entered the couple's bedroom. They startled Rusty and Becky awake, and Dusty and Tony pointed their weapons at them. Naturally, they were terrified, begged for mercy, and didn't understand who had burst into their home and what they wanted. But the criminals had more important matters to attend to than explaining anything to their victims. They generously poured bleach all over the kitchen floor, took the computer where the surveillance camera footage was stored, and, after tying the victims' hands with zip ties, led them to the car. It's remarkable how much effort the accomplices put in to avoid getting caught. In light of this, it's simply astonishing that Tony himself confessed his involvement in this to a stranger in a bar. Be that as it may, they dropped off Wendy at home and went to the location chosen by Tony, now known to the police. The accomplices parked the car in a field right in front of the dense forest, so vast that no one would hear a gunshot or screams. Tony instructed Dusty and Philip to wait while he led the spouses away. In their pajamas, barefoot, at gunpoint, they obediently walked into the woods. It's hard to imagine what they were feeling at that moment. Surely they understood they wouldn't be coming back, but they obediently pressed forward. According to Philip, he and Dusty sat for 10 minutes when they heard a gunshot, and it was only another 10 minutes later that the second shot rang out. The horror those 10 minutes must have been for the second victim. Tony never revealed what happened in that abandoned shack in the middle of the dense forest. There are many self-evident assumptions about this, but due to lack of evidence, they remain just that. And Philip could only talk about what he knew for sure. And according to his admission, it was only when his father emerged from the darkness of the forest alone that he began to understand what they had just done. After Philip's confession, investigators had only one question left that demanded an answer, although they already suspected the answer. Why did his father decide to kill two people he had never even met before? For this job, he was promised $100,000. And for Philip, this was no secret. It was Rusty's uncle, Robert Campbell, and his wife, Carolyn, Tony's sister. It was Robert who was the mastermind behind the murder, planning the attack for a time when he himself was supposed to be away in Texas. In fact, aside from disputes over the 49-hectare plot of land they lived on, he had a second motive. Robert was selling stolen equipment and using his property for these purposes. Rusty and Becky didn't like this, and they weren't going to stay silent about it. They raised a fuss that annoyed Robert. Becky was very afraid that unknown individuals were lurking around their home, so her husband installed cameras facing different directions from the house. Irritated by their behavior, Robert decided to get rid of them, to silence them forever. Naturally, he turned to Tony, a hardened criminal, and conveniently enough, his wife's brother. As the police learned, he approached Tony with a request to kill his nephew. Tony inquired about Becky, to which Robert coldly replied, "If she's there too, then kill her too." Tony agreed. Robert was arrested, but he stubbornly denied everything. He constantly reminded the investigators that he had an alibi. When the charges were brought against him, Tony and Dusty pleaded guilty. Tony and Dusty were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. Wendy decided to try her luck in court, was found guilty, and received a similar punishment. Robert also opted for trial, which made prosecutors nervous. Except for Philip's testimony, they had nothing solid against him. However, Philip agreed to testify against him and performed well in court. It was thanks to him that Robert was convicted. He was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. He will never see the light of day again. For his cooperation and willingness to plead guilty, Philip was sentenced to 13 years. Robert's wife, Carolyn, took her own life, unable to bear it all. She faced charges only for perjury. Arguments in people's lives are common and inevitable, and nobody really expects that a dispute will result in such consequences as murder. Becky and Rusty didn't like Robert's illegal side job, and they didn't hesitate to speak out about it directly. They knew it was dangerous. Becky openly feared the suspicious individuals who appeared near their home, and Rusty even installed a series of cameras to protect his wife. Unfortunately, it didn't save them. On that fateful night, when the couple walked into the woods in their pajamas and barefoot, did they suspect that Uncle Robert was to blame, wishing to get rid of the troublesome nephew and free up the house? Did the killer say anything to them before pulling the trigger? Or did the spouses believe to the last that it was some random attack, and the quarrels with Uncle Robert were just silly arguments, and he would never harm his nephew and his wife? Brent Pool took his wife's hand and surveyed the stretch of sandy beach between the Atlantic Ocean and vast dunes. They strolled slowly past private beach houses, and as they were engulfed by the darkness of the last untouched miles of forest running alongside the shore, the young man once again marveled at how romantic Myrtle Beach was. Situated between South Carolina and North Carolina, it was at the heart of the popular Grand Strand Beach. Like many tourists before him, Brent was enchanted by the rhythmic movement of the waves crashing onto the white sandy beach. Hand in hand with his beloved wife, he felt warm and joyful in his heart. Chuckling like a boy, Brent suggested to Renee, "Let's do it right here." The girl smiled and began to undress. A light breeze blowing in from the ocean cooled their naked bodies as the young couple enjoyed each other's company. After a while, Brent helped Renee get dressed, and he checked his watch. It was nearly midnight. They needed to head back to the hotel. Walking back hand in hand, they made plans for the future. In the distance, they noticed a large man dressed in black, his body covered tightly. But it wasn't just his appearance that frightened them. It was the fact that the man, who was initially heading in a different direction, suddenly turned and started following them. They picked up their pace, but they couldn't shake him off. The man ran ahead and leapt in front of them. He wore a ski mask, and in his hands was a gun that he pointed at the young couple. The weapon was black and looked almost like a plastic toy. The man ordered them to lie down on the ground. This guy is crazy, Renee thought. Brent remembered that he had an army Swiss knife in his pocket, which he bought at a flea market for Christmas. But what could he do with a knife against a gun? The stranger demanded that they hand over all their valuables. After taking their jewelry and money, the robber aimed the gun at Brent. He pulled the trigger once, twice, 3 times, but the gun refused to fire. While the robber confidently reloaded the weapon, a terrified Renee hoped that it was all just a tasteless joke and that he would leave soon. Then the man aimed the gun at Brent again. Brent begged him to spare his life. The robber smirked, glanced at Renee, and asked why he should spare him. "Because I have a daughter whom I love very much," Brent replied firmly. The shooter's eyes narrowed. He put the gun under Brent's chin and made him kneel. He pulled the trigger for the 4th time. Only this time, there was no misfire. Brent probably didn't hear the shot or feel it. But the shooter seemed unsatisfied and fired again. He wanted to make sure Brent was dead, although there was no need. The stranger turned and walked toward Renee, who lay on the sand, trembling with fear. She thought she would be the next one, but the stranger simply turned abruptly and ran toward the dunes. Renee got on her knees and called her husband's name softly through her tears. Just 10 minutes ago, they were celebrating their 3rd wedding anniversary, making plans for the future, joyfully discussing their little daughter Katie's first trip to the ocean. Renee sat by Brent, frightened and shocked. It's unclear how long she stayed in that state, but finally, she realized she needed to call for help. She remembered seeing a patrol car in the distance with her husband. With difficulty, she staggered in that direction. On June 9, 1998, shortly before midnight, Myrtle Beach patrolman Scott Brown was cruising along the deserted coastline of the Grand Strand when the headlights of his SUV suddenly caught sight of a girl frantically waving at him in the darkness. She was in a state of hysteria, and it's not surprising given what she told the patrolman. It was far beyond anything Scott was used to dealing with, like stolen wallets. But a stolen wallet was just the beginning of Renee's story. The masked stranger dressed in black had robbed them, and then he shot her husband twice in the head. The girl recounted how they obediently did everything the stranger told them, but it didn't save them. Scott, who had recently become a patrolman, was stunned upon hearing what had happened. Nonetheless, he quickly got his bearings and called for backup. On the crime scene, the arriving police officers found casings indicating that the perpetrator had used an automatic or semi-automatic weapon, which he took with him. This meant that the criminal was armed and possibly looking for another victim in the popular tourist area of the Grand Strand. The city's police, heavily reliant on tourism, could not afford another murder. They dedicated all their resources to finding the robber. The search led K9 units up to the road, but if the killer had a car, no one had seen it. Meanwhile, the police took Renee to the station, where they checked her hands for gunpowder residue. As a precautionary measure, they didn't find any. The police had no reason to suspect her, but the entire scenario of what had happened was troubling. A random beach robbery was unusual in itself, but a robbery and murder on the beach was almost unheard of. The strangest part of Renee's story, from the police's perspective, was that she survived to tell it. If the robber decided to shoot his victim in the head to eliminate a potential witness, then why leave Renee alive? She wasn't even tied up, and she was not struck or gagged. Renee recounted that the gun clicked, as if there were no more bullets left. The casings found on the beach seemed to confirm her words. According to her account, it appeared that it was her lucky day. Meanwhile, the police had the difficult task of informing the parents of the 24-year-old young man that their son had been killed. Interestingly, the first thing the parents asked was whether his wife was with him. And then they revealed to the police the unusual dynamics of the marital couple. Growing up in the suburbs of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Renee always had a way with guys. She caught Brent Pool's eye in a serendipitous encounter in 1991 when they met in the school parking lot. A friend of Brent asked him to give Renee a ride home, and during that ride, Brent invited her on a date. Their whirlwind romance led to the news that they would become parents in March 1995, just 3 months after Renee turned 17. Brent proposed to Renee, traditionally getting down on one knee. Both of their families were unsure if they would be able to handle the responsibilities of parenthood. Fortunately, at 21 years old, Brent already had a promising career as a mechanic, working double shifts and making a decent income for a young man. Brent and Renee even managed to buy a small house in a residential area near Winston-Salem. At first glance, it seemed like things were going well for the young couple, but after the birth of their daughter in 1996, financial problems began to arise. To overcome their financial struggles, at Brent's suggestion, Renee took up a job as an exotic dancer at a local club in the spring of the following year. Brent was proud of his wife's job, and Renee enjoyed her new lifestyle. Her new job promised to help the family forget about their financial woes, with earnings ranging from $200 to $400 per night. However, Renee brought more than just cash home from the club. She became involved with some of her female co-workers, and according to rumors circulating in the club, Brent was supportive of these relationships. It seemed that he was open to experimenting in their marriage. But one of Renee's affairs turned out to be more serious than she had anticipated. In the spring of 1998, Renee began dating John Boyd Frazier, a computer systems technician and a DJ from the club. John was a pleasant young man, known for being generous with the ladies. Rumors suggested that this aspect of him was what attracted Renee to him. As Brent spent more time with his friends and, in Renee's opinion, didn't help her enough with their child, she decided to pack her bags, take their 2-year-old daughter, and move in with John. However, just a few days after the move, Renee met with a lawyer who explained to her that given her occupation as an exotic dancer and her relatively liberal views on relationships, she was unlikely to secure full custody of her daughter. This made Renee reconsider her decision to leave her husband. Renee packed her things and returned home to her husband. Brent, who was willing to do anything to keep Renee,
welcomed her back with open arms. To celebrate their reconciliation, the whole family went on vacation to Myrtle Beach. The family vacation started off wonderfully, with them all enjoying a few days basking in the sun on the beach. However, on the evening of June 9th, on the 3rd anniversary of their wedding, Renee and Brent decided to spend the evening just the two of them. Renee had arranged for a babysitter for their daughter, Katie, at the hotel, but when the sitter arrived, their plans were almost derailed as Katie started crying. Brent tried to comfort their daughter, but Renee practically pushed him out of the hotel room. The couple visited 2 night spots, had dinner, and had a few cocktails. Then, a little after 11 o'clock, they decided to take advantage of the many secluded spots near their hotel. What happened next was known to the police. Upon learning the name of Renee's lover, the Myrtle Beach police called Salem to request an immediate visit to John's house and verify if he was there. They also spoke with Renee again. She confirmed the statements made by Brent's parents. Renee admitted that she had been involved with other men, including her affair with John, but claimed that all those affairs were in the past. However, she was uncertain if John agreed with her on this. Under pressure from the detectives, Renee admitted that she wasn't sure. By 5 a.m. on June 10th, Brent had been dead for 5 hours, and the Myrtle Beach police had a suspect in the murder, John Frazier. Detectives found out that he had called in sick to work on that day when he was supposed to be working. Unfortunately for the investigators, when they knocked on John's door, he was at home. It was almost impossible for him to travel to Myrtle Beach, commit the crime, return, change clothes, and then open the door for the police. The police had no choice but to apologize, wish him a good night, and leave. The police took up the investigation again with Renee. She came to the station accompanied by a lawyer, not a criminal defense attorney, but one who had helped her sister in her divorce. Renee repeated her story when suddenly her lawyer interrupted the conversation. He asked to speak with his client alone. But just when the investigators thought the conversation was over, they faced an unexpected surprise. Upon returning to the interrogation room, the lawyer instructed Renee to tell everything she knew. And Renee confessed that John was the one who pulled the trigger that night. She recognized him by his voice and mannerisms. Justifying herself, she claimed that she had to convince herself first that it was him. Now the police had to find out how John ended up on a secluded beach in another city on June 9th. Fortunately, a witness appeared at the right time. Bruce Wolford, a bartender at the club where Renee worked and John's friend, heard Renee talking to John about her plans to go to Myrtle Beach with her husband for their wedding anniversary. He also mentioned seeing John attempting to fight Brent on one occasion. In John's daily planner, the police found a note under June 9th that said Renee and Brent, although it was later discovered that he simply marked all the important dates of his friends and acquaintances. John was immediately arrested, but unlike Renee, he didn't give away a single word. The investigators believed that they would get the whole story from Renee. She made a mistake when she recanted her initial testimony. She was arrested right next to the funeral home and taken in for questioning. The detective did everything possible to extract information from Renee, even if it meant deceiving her. Although John Frazier refused to speak, the detective falsely told Renee that John had confessed to killing her husband at her request. They threatened her, saying that she would never see her daughter again unless she accused John of the crime and revealed where he had hidden the weapon. Gradually, after a 2-hour interrogation, Renee's story began to change. She confessed that she knew about John's threats to kill Brent but didn't take her lover's words seriously. The next day, Renee was accused of murder, and the prosecutor decided to insist on the harshest punishment for her. Her defense attorney, who specializes in criminal cases, demanded that she withdraw her confession. The case against Renee was essentially based on the fact that John was the shooter. However, the prosecutors faced serious difficulties. Apart from Renee's confession, they had no other evidence. To prove that Renee lured her husband out of the hotel room to set up John as the shooter, they needed a witness who could link her lover to the crime scene. and they found 2 witnesses right away. 2 elderly individuals were also staying at the same hotel as the couple and coincidentally celebrating their wedding anniversary there. On the day after the murder, they contacted the police to report that they had been on the beach the previous evening and saw a man dressed in black who frightened them. They identified John from a photograph, claiming that he appeared suspicious and they remembered his face. Although this statement immediately raised many doubts because it was nighttime and the beach had limited lighting, making it unlikely for them to clearly see a man at a considerable distance. Nevertheless, the prosecutors attempted to convict Renee, hoping that her accomplice would then admit guilt. Renee's guilt hinged on what she knew about John's plan. However, if John was not the murderer, then she had no connection to the crime at all. Detectives managed to pressure the shocked girl into confessing, which became the primary evidence against her in the case. Renee lost 15 pounds during this ordeal. They desperately needed a confession to prevent tourists from fearing to visit the city. It was crucial for them to portray Brent's death as something other than a random robbery. Renee's defense attorney believes that she was convicted for her lifestyle. However, the prosecutors argued that her lifestyle had a more significant impact on Brent. Being unfaithful to her husband and working in such a profession made divorce not an option for her. It seemed more logical to get rid of Brent. Her reunion with her husband was just one step in her fatal betrayal because being with her boyfriend during her husband's murder did not play in her favor. The jury deliberated for a long time and finally found the prosecution's arguments more compelling. Kimberly Renee Pool was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial of John, who had no intention of admitting guilt, took place shortly after that. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison despite the lack of actual evidence against him. The prosecutors didn't even call Bruce Wolford to testify. If Bruce had been a reliable witness, the prosecutors would have been eager to put him on the stand and convince the jury that John was the only person with a motive to remove Brent Pool from the picture. The problem was that there were several people who liked Renee and saw her husband as an obstacle, and Bruce Wolford was at the top of that list. Darrell Wilson, a private detective hired by John Fraser's mother, thoroughly investigated the case and came to the conclusion that Bruce was just as likely a suspect as John. The former police officer spoke not only with Bruce but also with many other witnesses involved in the case. In particular, he found Chris Hensley, another witness completely ignored by the police, who had a much better view and recollection of what happened on the beach that night. Firstly, he deduced what Renee and Brent were doing on the beach after seeing Brent's unbuttoned shirt. Secondly, he encountered a man dressed in black who passed very close to him, and Chris even greeted him out of politeness. According to Chris, the composite sketch based on his description didn't resemble John at all. However, when the private detective showed Chris a computer-generated composite and pictures of Bruce, Chris stated that the man in the photo matched the composite sketch very closely based on what he remembered about the person's height, hair, and face. Even more incriminating was the fact that Bruce had installed spyware on Renee's home computer, giving him complete control over her computer. This allowed him to monitor Renee's activities for 6 months, knowing everything about her whereabouts and plans, and reading all her emails and messages. Bruce became even more suspicious given that he owned a semi-automatic pistol and had access to a white van with a number sticker on the window, similar to the one witnesses saw on the beach before the murder. By killing Brent and framing John for the crime, Bruce could eliminate 2 rivals at once. After the trial, a campaign for the review of Renee's case began. Her new attorney filed an appeal on the grounds that her predecessor had performed poorly in her duties. The court-appointed public defender only met with Renee once before the trial, and that was just to push her to agree to a 30-year sentence in exchange for confessing to conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecutors implanted in the minds of the jury the idea that there was no robbery at all because approximately a month after the murder, Brent's wallet was found in the yard of a nearby house with $9 in cash, Brent's driver's license, and a bank card he used to pay for dinner at a restaurant. However, the defense attorney could easily prove that $50 were missing from Brent's wallet, which he had withdrawn from an ATM on the night of the murder to pay the babysitter. Moreover,
the babysitter's testimony about Renee's alleged haste was misinterpreted. The babysitter could only sit with the child from 9 p.m. to 12 a.m., and she got lost, took some time to find the right hotel, and was 15 minutes late. Therefore, Renee was in a hurry to go for a walk with her husband just to spend more time with him within the 3-hour time frame allocated for babysitting. These are not all the facts that were not presented by the defense at the trial. In particular, there were electronic emails confirming that it was Brent who suggested going to Myrtle Beach. So, it wasn't Renee who lured her husband to a secluded beach. It was Brent who wanted to add some excitement to their intimate life, which is why they bought a beach towel on the way back from the restaurant at 10:52 p.m. Since they were supposed to go back home the next day, it was their last evening when Brent's desire could be fulfilled. Everything happened spontaneously. If it was premeditated, Renee would have taken a small towel with her to ensure nothing hindered the execution of her plan. Moreover, if the murder was planned, it would have been more logical for Renee to keep her husband in a secluded, wooded area until her accomplice arrived. However, the crime occurred as they were returning to the hotel. When they noticed a stranger following them, they hurried their pace. Brent even had time to draw his knife and potentially alter the situation in his favor. The Brent family has initiated an investigation along this path, claiming that Renee is responsible for everything. They have turned against her, blaming her for the moral choices their son made and desired. Renee's attorney should emphasize that Brent himself wanted her to work as a stripper and engage in relationships with other people, undermining the prosecution's theory. As Renee continues to fight for what is called mitigation of punishment after the verdict, she serves her sentence in prison. Brent's parents have been granted custody of Katie, although Renee managed to build a healthy and loving relationship with her daughter. In prison, Renee creates Braille textbooks for blind children, and her colleagues and supervisors highly value her work. To this day, she maintains her claim of innocence and insists that she does not know who robbed them with Brent and shot her husband.
Christmas 2017 didn't start off well for the Aguilar family from Elche, Spain. The family owns a bakery, so the holidays are the busiest time for their business. Spouses Rosa and Alberto Aguilar decided not to keep all the earnings at home and took them to the bank. But when Rosa approached the cupboard where the family kept the money, only small change fell out of the pouch. 6,000 or 7,000 euros were missing. The spouses were afraid they had been robbed, but the door lock was intact, and there were no signs of a break-in in the house either. Then they decided that perhaps their daughter Patricia knows more. Patricia Aguilar is the eldest child of Alberto and Rosa. 2 weeks ago, she turned 18. Patricia was a typical teenager, albeit a bit introverted and shy. She studied art and spent a lot of time in her room on the computer. Her parents were worried that she had few friends and was becoming reclusive. Therefore, Rosa was very happy when her daughter said she had been invited to a birthday party. The girl left with an overnight bag and has not returned since. Her parents wrote and called her, but she did not answer. They didn't know what to think. Considering that the money went missing at the same time as Patricia, Alberto decided to contact the police, but the police were confident she would return soon and didn't rush to find the 18-year-old girl. By evening, the issue of money no longer concerned the parents. They wrote to Patricia that they wouldn't scold her as long as she returned home. That night, they couldn't close their eyes. When they finally received the message, "Everything is fine, I will contact you in a few hours," from their daughter Alberto and Rosa didn't buy it. The message was not written in the way their daughter would have done it. Now the parents were convinced that something had happened. The most likely scenario seemed to them that the thief who stole the money had kidnapped the girl and taken her phone. Rosa couldn't sit and wait, knowing that the police were not taking any action, so she went into her daughter's room and searched through all her belongings. Every book, notebook, pillow, stuffed toy. She even looked under the lamp and behind the paintings. She realized she had found what she was looking for, although it was not at all what she expected. There were some esoteric symbols, descriptions of rituals written by Patricia's hand, and also clear instructions for a trip and marriage registration in Peru with descriptions of the necessary documents. Shocked, Rosa asked her husband if their daughter had run away to Peru to get married there, with whom. The police assured them that the girl had not crossed the country's borders. The plot thickened. Among her daughter's belongings, Rosa found photos of adult women she didn't know. Then for the first time,
the thought crept into her mind that a cult might be behind all this, which she hurried to share with the police. But they dismissed her again, because 2 weeks ago the girl turned legal age and could do whatever she wanted. Weeks passed without any news, and Rosa and Alberto decided to turn to the public. They understood that the internet would be of invaluable help to them in this, but the Aguilar spouses were not familiar with it. They didn't even use social networks. Therefore, they turned to Noelia, Rosa's cousin. Patricia treated her as an older sister. Noelia responded in kind, and when her help was needed without hesitation, Noelia closed her shop in Benidorm and came to Elche. It was not difficult for her to find out that Patricia had been communicating a lot with some guy who sent her lists of books on black magic and esoterica. One word appeared particularly often in her notes: gnosis. As Noelia read, the concept of Gnosticism involves the search for knowledge, truth, but in the 1950s, several groups emerged claiming that allegedly to be saved in the apocalypse, one needed to cleanse oneself of sins. This could be done by engaging in intimate relationships as often as possible. Becoming carriers of such truth, the new followers of the doctrine had to renounce their families because other people were doomed, they were enemies. After finding all this out, Patricia's relatives realized that they didn't really know the girl, and that she had been living a double life for a long time. A few more days passed, and Patricia got in touch. She wrote to Noelia that she was fine, but she wouldn't return, and attached a photo showing her holding a piece of paper with the date. She explained that she and her boyfriend were traveling in a mobile home across Europe, and they were currently in Pitești. But Pitești is in Romania, and the police assured them that the girl had not left Spanish territory. A quick search online told Noelia that on that day in Pitești, the temperature had dropped to -6 degrees Celsius, and the girl was wearing just a t-shirt. Noelia tried to call her back and found out that the girl's phone operator only serves South American countries. If, according to the police, Patricia had not left Spain, how did her phone do that? When Noelia tried to confront Patricia with this new information, she became agitated and rudely demanded to be left alone. But Noelia wasn't going to give up. In fact, the police were mistaken. On the very first day of her disappearance, when Patricia supposedly went to her friend's birthday party, she flew to Lima, Peru. After 2 years of online communication, she finally met her beloved, Stephen. He met her at the airport and immediately took her to a hotel. There, he became Patricia's first man. Thanks to the money she brought with her, they were able to rent a small apartment, where Patricia met 29-year-old Mariori Garcia Valverde and 42-year-old Paula Vega, the other, as he called them, wives of the man. Patricia knew she would become Stephen's third wife, but he didn't warn her that they would live with 4 children, Paula's daughter and 2 girls and a boy from Mariori. So 8 people ended up living in a small apartment, and there was no space for intimacy, which they were supposed to engage in every day. Stephen and Patricia met 2 years ago. It was a very difficult time for the teenage girl. Patricia had an uncle, her mother's brother, Jose. He loved his niece very much, spoiled her, spent time with her when her parents were busy. For Patricia, he was both an older brother and a father figure. However, in 2015, 29-year-old Jose fell ill. He was diagnosed with pancreatitis. People recover from this illness, but complications arose in Jose's case. He passed away within 4 months. The whole family was devastated. While Alberto was able to fully immerse himself in work, his wife Rosa and Patricia couldn't cope with the pain of loss. Rosa developed depression and found solace in simple computer games that allowed her to distract herself. Unfortunately, during this time, she distanced herself from her children and husband, and Patricia, who needed the support of her loved ones more than ever, became very vulnerable. She began to ponder what happens after death, as she could not accept that death was the end. She became interested in this topic, visited relevant websites, and she met Stephen, a man with very developed communicative and manipulative abilities. He studied psychology books to know how to penetrate the consciousness of every person. He called himself a savior, a messenger facing the impending end of the world, apocalypse. He made naive girls believe that they were a couple in a past life, and that his wives, his queens, had a mission to populate the world after the apocalypse. Stephen realized that Patricia was the perfect victim because she was a teenager, and, as is often the case at that age, felt insecure and believed that nobody cared about her. All of this combined with her natural innocence. Stephen took advantage of her psychological vulnerability due to her uncle's death and used his persuasive methods to lure her into his traps. While her family was preoccupied, For 2 years, Stephen worked on the girl's mind to isolate her, and no one noticed anything until it was too late. The girl believed she was safe because Stephen was on the other side of the globe. He gradually manipulated her, first asking for pictures in lingerie, then nude. Only after that did they discuss intimate moments, and the girl agreed that he had 2 wives. He explained this by saying that from a biological point of view, a man is created for relationships with many women. But a woman can only have one husband because a woman is a temple. Relationships with a man allow a woman to progress spiritually. A man can do this himself, but for a woman, this is the only way. And now, after 2 years of online communication, Patricia gave up everything and ran away to Stephen. He gave her a new name, Silvana, which means born in the jungle. But she had to get used not only to the new name. She had never taken forbidden substances, and Stephen made her consume a root that caused strong hallucinations. He didn't hesitate to give it to the children either. Meanwhile, the girl's family didn't give up trying to find her. They were lucky that Patricia left plenty of clues behind. Among her notes, Noelia found logins and passwords to computer games and social networks. One attracted her attention because it was repeated several times. Nicoli. It turned out to be the girl's secret page, where she expressed her thoughts about the afterlife. Among her friends, Noelia noticed a young man named Steven Martinez, and in his friends list there were only girls, 3,000 girls, all roughly Patricia's age. Noelia suspected that he might be behind all this. It was some progress, but for now, Noelia only found the guy's name on the internet. They needed evidence. Then the girl's mother searched Patricia's room again and noticed an interesting document. It turned out to be a medical certificate issued by a hospital in Lima, Peru, in the name of Paula Vega. Rosa realized they had stumbled upon a significant lead, finding Patricia's connection to Peru. The parents turned to the police, who passed the information to Interpol and eventually to the police in Peru. Stephen became nervous when the police called Paula and asked for clarification regarding Patricia. Even before Patricia's escape, he had asked her to forge a medical certificate for Paula, but instead of destroying the copy, she put it in a drawer in her room and completely forgot about it. And now they had problems. If Paula testified, the police would start digging deeper. Stephen decided to get Patricia out of trouble. They went together to the police station. Like a vulture, he watched her every word, controlling her every move. At his direction, the girl told the officers that nobody had kidnapped her and that she wanted to live in Peru. Since Patricia was of legal age, the police saw no crime. They simply let the couple go. This disappointed the girl's family, but at least they learned Stephen's full name, Felix Stephen Manrique Gomez, and they decided to change their approach, to turn to the media. This decision changed everything. The Aguilar family wanted as many people as possible to learn about Stephen's methods, to prevent him from luring other girls into his cult. It was risky because Stephen could either send Patricia home or flee with her. As it turned out, Stephen chose the third option. As soon as he saw his face on the news program, he smashed all the phones and computers and kicked Patricia out of the apartment. He ordered her to contact the embassy to get the opportunity to contact the media and fix everything. Until then, she would be alone on the street, without food or shelter. After a few days, she managed to reach out to a TV program and give an interview live. At first, her parents were relieved to see she was alive. But the things she said broke their hearts. The girl didn't hold back her words, aiming to hurt her parents to the core. She stated that she didn't want to know Rosa and Alberto because they were bad parents. Her father was never home. Her mother played computer games for days, and nobody paid attention to her, didn't feed her or buy her clothes. She considered her Uncle Jose as her real father, and essentially her grandmother raised her. Patricia demanded that they remove all information from the internet, all photos, messages about the search, and send her money. Only then would she send them her address. After that, she would decide what to do next. Finally, she told her father, "Do you know why I was so happy in the photos from my birthday? I dreamed of running away since I was 14, and now I finally could leave home." It was painful for the parents to hear this, and many of their acquaintances and even relatives believed the girl's words. After such a shocking statement, both the police and the media lost interest in the case. But her family didn't give up. Noelia decided to make the most of social media opportunities. She created a fake profile similar to Patricia's and requested to be friends with Stephen. She tried to portray herself as a teenage girl interested in esoterics, but perhaps she pressed too hard, asking for his phone number to communicate in Messenger. He suspected that she wasn't who she claimed to be, but mistook her for some Karen. He blocked her.
But Noelia was already unstoppable. In Stephen's friend list, she found one Karen. It was a girl whose photo she had already seen among Patricia's belongings. Contacting her, Noelia learned that Karen had also been in the cult, but she managed to break free from Stephen's clutches. However, her sister Mai not only had been with him, but also was his only official wife. Karen confessed that she was afraid for her sister and advised reaching out to her mother Alinda. Perhaps she could help in some way. Despite Patricia partially managing to improve the situation with her interview, Stephen turned into a paranoid. He moved the girls and children to San Martin de Pangoa, a region 12 hours away from Lima by bus in the middle of the jungle. It was a dangerous place with water and electricity shortages, and they could go weeks without bathing, both adults and children. There was also a lack of money for food. The meager coins they had were spent on candles and hallucinogenic roots that Stephen used during rituals. Patricia, now called Silva, deleted all her social media accounts, cut her long hair, and dyed it black. It was tough for the fugitives. A man with 3 women and 4 children, one of whom was clearly a foreigner. Cornered, Stephen became increasingly aggressive. He began mistreating Patricia very badly. Once he even told Mai, maybe we should just kill her, but it wasn't easier for the others. He severely beat the children and girls, using a leather whip, the effect of which was like being hit by 3 whips simultaneously. He beat the children for any reason, especially Mai's son, the only boy. Patricia got tired of this quickly and told Stephen that she would leave him, to which he threatened to take his anger out on the children. Despite the girls being willing to do anything for Stephen, even give their lives for him, he soon started asking for things that were beyond even their limits. Living nearby were girls who were rumored to be night butterflies despite their young age. Mai made the mistake of mentioning this to her husband. Stephen claimed that the girls would supposedly help him with a new ritual and demanded to arrange a meeting. But Mai couldn't do it because they were underage. She even considered Patricia too young for Stephen. The man became so enraged that he grabbed his wife by the neck and began to strangle her. She was almost suffocated and couldn't breathe. He would have killed her if Patricia hadn't intervened. Only then did Stephen release his victim. Patricia felt terrible, longing to return home to her parents but afraid of what they would say after all her actions. She lost her zest for life until suddenly everything changed. She realized she was expecting a child. Many advised the Aguilar family to forget about Patricia and stop searching, but her parents decided otherwise. Rosa stayed with her younger son in Elche, while Alberto went to Peru because they couldn't achieve much from Spain. But Peru was a large country, and Alberto was a stranger there, so he sought the support of Alinda, the mother of Karen and Mai. They found a prosecutor willing to help them, and the police began investigating, treating the case as one of human trafficking. The first place the officers visited was Patricia's apartment, from where Stephen had already taken her. Alberto could barely hold himself together when neighbors told stories of often hearing screams and blows and witnessing the girls being forced into intimate relationships in front of the children. Since Stephen had taken the children out of school and away with the girls in an unknown direction, detectives decided to track their phones. Stephen was horrified at the thought of being found, so the phones were almost always turned off. All they could do was wait for someone in the group to turn on their phone. Meanwhile, investigators found out who this Stephen was. The 35-year-old man was born in Lima into a poor and troubled family. He was bullied by other boys at school, which led him to spend time only with girls. From childhood, he learned how to manipulate them. His father gave him a book that helped Stephen join the Gnostics, but he was expelled because he drew ideas from other cults and called himself a prophet. Gradually, he came to found his own cult. When Stephen and the girls ran out of money, they moved to Alto Selendon, a tiny village with 30 houses. They settled into a hut right in the middle of the jungle. Mostly drug dealers and those avoiding the police, like them, inhabited the area. There was no water, electricity, or food in the hut. At best, they ate only rice and potatoes. Patricia was already 8 months pregnant, but due to severe malnutrition, it seemed like she was only in her 3rd month. The hut was surrounded by huge puddles, and everyone had to constantly wear boots. Fungal infections appeared on everyone's feet, even the children. Their feet were covered in insect bite marks, and their heads had colonies of lice. It was a disgusting place for them and the children, including the unborn ones, because Mai was also pregnant. Mai feared for her children's health. It was very difficult for her in such conditions.
Despite her husband's prohibition, she turned on her phone and called her mother, just to hear her voice. The girl didn't even say anything, but it was enough for the police to trace the call. Detectives believed the fugitives were in Lima, but it turned out Stephen had taken them deep into the jungle. The police decided to send 2 officers to the region who knew the case best. They were given 10 days to search. They showed pictures of the group members to everyone passing by, assuming that the girl resembling Patricia would stand out among the other locals. The officers didn't know that she had not only changed her appearance, but also didn't have permission to leave the city. The police decided to go even higher into the mountains. Their persistence paid off. One girl they showed the pictures to recognized Paula. She described her as a strange woman in pink boots who returns home every evening across the bridge with a food package. The officers began to wait at the bridge, and the woman indeed appeared. She moved like a robot, not looking at anyone. The officers followed her. 40 minutes later, they went beyond the city limits and deeper into the forest. Finally, she entered a house where rooms were rented out. The police decided to rent a room in the house because otherwise they couldn't conduct surveillance. They were lucky. They got a room right next to Paula's. They could hear everything happening in the other room. They heard the voices of a man, Paula, and another girl. It turned out to be Mai. But Patricia or the children were not visible. The police did not take more decisive action because Stephen never left the room, not even to use the restroom, and they were not sure if it was him. Naturally, he didn't work. Paula and Mai did while the man lay in bed, and the officers were afraid that he simply wouldn't say where Patricia was. Suddenly, they overheard the man saying that tomorrow they would split up and leave one by one. Stephen planned to go even further to settlements of more wild indigenous tribes. Upon hearing this, the police officers called for backup to capture them. Knowing their schedule, they were able to apprehend group members one by one. Paula was stopped when she left for work early in the morning. Mai also left the house to do laundry. As for Stephen, when the police entered, he was lying on the bed as usual. The man resisted, introduced himself by another name, and pretended not to understand what was happening. To prevent him from stepping barefoot on the floor, pregnant Mai gave him her shoes. After that, he was forcibly removed from the hut. Fortunately, the girls immediately disclosed where Patricia was. By Stephen's command, Patricia and all the children remained in the hut as far away in the jungle as possible when Stephen, Mai, and Paula went to earn money, although Stephen, of course, didn't work. Patricia did everything around the house, took care of the children, and even worked on the plantation near the hut. She was there when the officers arrived. They called her by name. She had become so accustomed to the name Silvana that hearing Patricia felt unfamiliar. The officers believed they were rescuing Patricia and 4 children, but there were already 5. When Stephen, Paula, and Mai left for the city, Patricia begged not to be left alone, but Stephen was adamant, and predictably, at 8.5 months, she began having contractions. She screamed in agony. The children were with her but didn't know how to help her. At the girl's screams, a neighbor came. She was the one who assisted in the delivery. Patricia admits that she never thought she would give birth in the jungle at 19. The girl was extremely thin, looked exhausted when they rescued her, but even then she continued to think only about Stephen and the things he instilled in her. Meanwhile, Stephen was interrogated at the police station. An interesting fact emerged during the investigation. He was left alone with 2 colleagues briefly, and when they returned, one officer had already fallen under his influence. She claimed that Stephen was a prophet and they should help him, not arrest him. Immediately after Patricia, Mai, and Paula were rescued, they were separated as recommended by psychologists. They received assistance as victims of cults, sects, and dependent groups. It took them a long time before they started feeling better. They seemed to be in a lethargic state, but eventually, they woke up. The Aguilar family says that now everything that happened is in the past. They started anew, without accusations, without questions, without doubts. Patricia is still undergoing therapy and lives in her hometown with her parents and daughter. She received education in social rehabilitation and works in an organization that helps people with disabilities. Stephen was sentenced to 20 years in prison for human trafficking, sexual and labor exploitation. Many wondered how Patricia's parents didn't notice the changes in their daughter. Patricia was always a good student, but after her beloved uncle left her life, she started failing. Strangely enough, Stephen motivated her to study better, so they noticed changes in their daughter and they liked them. They thought she was coming to her senses. At that time, she was dating a boy from school whom her father didn't like. Alberto was happy when she dumped him. She stopped dressing in black, bought bright clothes, smiled more often, and asked to have a party for her 18th birthday. But her parents couldn't have known that all this was Stephen's demands. There were signs to pay attention to, but you never think that someone from another distant country will infiltrate your home through the internet and take away a family member. Dedication, obedience, detachment from the family happens very slowly, insidiously. It's in the cult's interest for their followers not to have loving and caring people around them. Everyone thinks that nothing like this will ever happen to them, but in moments of weakness, anyone can become vulnerable. Patricia Aguilar experienced firsthand what it's like to be isolated by a cult, taken out of her native country and taken away from her family. With her story, she wants to protect others from falling into the subtle mechanisms used by these false prophets. This case could have gone unnoticed by many, but became known thanks to Patricia's parents, who in their struggle to locate their daughter, managed to grab the attention of the media in different countries and share this story.